The Israel-Palestine conflict is more than headlines. It's a centuries-old struggle shaped by history, faith, and identity. To truly understand it, we must look beyond the surface and explore its deep, intertwined roots. Every landmark in Israel and Palestine is a living symbol, sacred, contested, and central to both peoples' identities, revealing how history and emotion fuel the ongoing conflict. Two peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, each see the same land as their ancestral home, creating a conflict where both national stories are deeply rooted, tragically parallel, and often in direct opposition. The same events, like the 1948 war, are celebrated as triumph by Israelis and mourned as catastrophe by Palestinians, showing how perspective shapes every aspect of this enduring conflict. From ancient empires to modern nationhood, the history of this land is a mosaic of faith, conquest, and competing dreams, each era leaving marks that still define the struggle today. The ultimate aim of this detailed exploration is to fulfill a simple but profound promise, the promise of context. In a conflict so often defined by heated emotion and partisan loyalty, context is the most valuable and scarcest commodity. Without it, we are left adrift in a sea of claims and counterclaims, unable to distinguish between historical fact and political myth. By providing a structured and comprehensive background, we hope to build a foundation for a more meaningful and empathetic understanding. This is not about finding easy answers, because easy answers do not exist for a problem this complex. Instead, it is about learning to ask better, more informed questions. This introduction has set the stage for the journey ahead. We have established that the headlines tell only a fraction of the story, and that the land itself serves as a witness to a layered and contested history. We have acknowledged the painful reality of two peoples with legitimate national aspirations clashing over the same territory. We have highlighted the critical importance of perspective, recognizing that the same events are experienced and remembered in vastly different ways. By weaving together these threads, we have created a framework for the deeper dive that will follow, preparing to examine the specific landmarks and historical turning points that define this enduring conflict. Our path forward will take us first to the sacred ground of Jerusalem, the epicenter of faith and friction. We will then travel across the land, from the ancient fortress of Masada to the modern metropolis of Tel Aviv, using each site as a key to unlock a piece of the narrative. From there, we will chronologically trace the political history, examining the rise of Zionism, the British Mandate, the Holocaust, the birth of Israel, and the catastrophe of the Nakba. We will then turn our focus to the Palestinian experience under occupation, the growth of settlements, and the ongoing struggle for statehood, bringing the story right up to the present day. We invite you to proceed with an open mind and a willingness to engage with stories that may be uncomfortable or challenging. The history of Israel and Palestine is a story of human beings, of their dreams, their fears, their triumphs, and their suffering. Our journey into the heart of this land must begin in Jerusalem, a city whose very name evokes millennia of prayer, conquest, and devotion. There is no other place on earth quite like it, where the sacred geography of three world religions is compressed into a few square kilometers of ancient stone. For Jews, it is the city of David, the site of the holy temples, and the eternal capital of the Jewish people, the focal point of their spiritual longing for thousands of years. For Christians, it is the stage upon which the central drama of their faith unfolded, the last days of Jesus' ministry, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. For Muslims, it is Al-Quds, the noble sanctuary, the first direction of prayer and the site of the Prophet Muhammad's miraculous night journey. The city is not just a backdrop for these beliefs, it is an essential part of them. The immense spiritual weight of Jerusalem is both its glory and its burden. This concentration of holiness has made it a magnet for pilgrims and a prize for emperors throughout history. The layers of its past are visible everywhere, with Roman columns standing near Crusader walls and Ottoman ramparts encircling sites sacred since the time of the Hebrew Bible. This layered history means that every archaeological dig, every construction project, and every political decision in Jerusalem carries a significance that ripples far beyond its municipal boundaries. It is a global city, where local disputes over zoning or access can quickly escalate into international incidents, drawing in the passions and politics of nations and faithful communities around the world. The Old City, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is the historical and spiritual core of Jerusalem, a labyrinth of narrow alleyways divided into four distinct quarters: Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Armenian. Within these ancient walls, The air is thick with the scent of incense and spices, the sounds of church bells, the call to prayer from minarets, and the murmur of Hebrew supplications. This sensory overload is a constant reminder of the intense, often uncomfortable proximity in which these communities live. Their coexistence is a delicate dance, a daily negotiation of shared spaces that are simultaneously sources of deep communal pride and potential points of friction, making the Old City a microcosm of the entire conflict. To understand Jerusalem is to understand that it is not one city, but many. There is the earthly Jerusalem, a vibrant and modern Israeli capital with government buildings, museums, and bustling neighborhoods. And there is the heavenly Jerusalem, a city of divine promise and eschatological importance that lives in the hearts and minds of billions worldwide. The conflict arises where these two concepts meet, where the political realities of the earthly city clash with the profound religious aspirations associated with the heavenly one. It is this collision of the temporal and the divine that makes Jerusalem the most contested piece of real estate on the planet and the essential starting point for our exploration. Our first stop within the Old City brings us to the Western Wall, known in Hebrew as the Kotel HaMa'aravi. This immense retaining wall of limestone blocks is the most sacred accessible site in Judaism, a place of pilgrimage and prayer for centuries. It is the last remnant of the outer fortifications that surrounded the Second Jewish Temple, which was built by Herod the Great and destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 CE. For nearly 2,000 years, the destruction of the temple has been the central trauma in Jewish history, symbolizing the loss of sovereignty and the beginning of a long and painful exile. The wall is all that remains, a tangible link to a glorious past and a symbol of an unbroken connection to this holy place. Visiting the Kotel today, one is immediately struck by the intensity of the devotion on display. The large plaza is separated into men's and women's sections where people from all corners of the Jewish world gather at all hours of the day and night. You see ultra-Orthodox men in black coats swaying back and forth in fervent prayer, soldiers in uniform placing their hands on the stones, and tourists from around the globe standing in silent awe. The air hums with the sound of whispered psalms and heartfelt pleas. The ancient stones themselves seem to weep, not with water, but with the collective memory of a people who, for 2 millennia, ended their Passover Seder with the hopeful declaration, "Next year in Jerusalem." One of the most iconic traditions associated with the wall is the practice of tucking small, folded notes bearing written prayers into its crevices. Millions of these notes carrying the hopes, dreams, and sorrows of individuals are placed in the wall each year. It is a deeply personal act of communication with the divine, a belief that a prayer left at this sacred spot has a more direct path to heaven. Twice a year, these notes are respectfully collected and buried in the nearby Mount of Olives, making way for new ones. This continuous cycle of prayer and renewal transforms the wall from a static historical monument into a living, breathing artery of Jewish spiritual life, a global repository of faith. The wall is more than just a religious site, it is a powerful national symbol for the modern state of Israel. After the 1948 war, the Old City fell under Jordanian control, and Jews were denied access to the wall for 19 years. Its recapture by Israeli paratroopers during the Six-Day War in 1967 was a moment of profound emotional and historical significance, televised to the nation and the world. The images of battle-hardened soldiers weeping at the wall encapsulated the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream. Today, it serves as a site for national ceremonies, including the induction of new soldiers into the Israel Defense Forces, cementing its role as a bedrock of both ancient faith and modern Israeli identity. Just above the Western Wall Plaza lies a vast, elevated stone platform that is arguably the most sensitive and contested religious site on Earth. To Jews, it is the Temple Mount, the holiest place in Judaism, the location of both the first and second temples, and the dwelling place of God's presence on earth. According to Jewish tradition, it is the site of the Even Hashtia, the foundation stone from which the world was created, and the location where Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. It is the direction to which Jews all over the world turn during prayer. For observant Jews, the ground itself is so holy that many refrain from setting foot upon it, for fear of treading on the location of the temple's inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies. To Muslims, this same platform is known as the Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary. It is the third holiest site in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. It is revered as the location from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during his miraculous night journey, or Isra and Miraj, an event mentioned in the Quran. The sanctuary houses two of Islam's most iconic structures, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. For over 1,300 years, this compound has been a center of Islamic worship, scholarship, and community life. Its control is a matter of immense religious and political importance for the entire Muslim world, a symbol of Islamic heritage and sovereignty in Jerusalem. This dual sanctity creates an environment of perpetual tension, where religion and politics are inextricably fused. The site is administered by the Jerusalem Islamic Waqf, a Jordanian-funded religious trust, but its security is controlled by the Israeli police, a delicate and often fractious arrangement known as the status quo. Under this arrangement, Muslims are permitted to pray freely on the compound, while non-Muslims, including Jews and Christians, are allowed to visit as tourists, but are strictly forbidden from praying or displaying any religious symbols. This restriction is a constant source of anger for religious Jewish activists who demand the right to pray at their holiest site, leading to frequent confrontations. The Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, is more than just a place of worship. It is a political tinderbox. Any perceived change to the status quo, however small, can ignite widespread unrest. A visit to the compound by a controversial politician, an archaeological excavation near its walls, or rumors of plans to alter access arrangements can be interpreted by Palestinians as a provocation and an attempt by Israel to assert greater control. These events have repeatedly triggered violent clashes in Jerusalem and beyond, demonstrating how this single sacred esplanade serves as the volatile epicenter of the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Its fate is central to any discussion of a final peace settlement, yet its holiness to both sides makes any compromise seem almost impossible. Dominating the Jerusalem skyline is the magnificent golden dome of the Qubat al-Sakra, the Dome of the Rock. It is not a mosque for congregational prayer but rather a shrine, and it stands as one of the oldest and most beautiful works of Islamic architecture in the world. Completed in the year 691 by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, its purpose was to enshrine the sacred rock at its center. This rock is believed by Muslims to be the point from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven on his celestial steed, Buraq. The structure was built as a powerful statement, asserting the presence and permanence of the new faith of Islam in a city that was, at the time, predominantly Christian. The building's design is a masterpiece of mathematical harmony and artistic splendor. Its octagonal structure is adorned with intricate, colorful mosaics, depicting jewels, crowns, and vegetation, deliberately avoiding any representation of human or animal forms in accordance with Islamic tradition. These mosaics are complemented by elaborate Arabic calligraphy from the Quran, which includes some of the earliest surviving inscriptions of the Holy Book. The Great Golden Dome, which was originally made of solid gold but is now anodized aluminum, shines like a beacon over the city, a testament to the glory of one of the great early Islamic empires. It is an architectural jewel that has become the most recognizable symbol of Jerusalem for people across the globe. For Palestinians and the wider Muslim world, the Dome of the Rock is a profound symbol of their connection to Jerusalem. It is a visual anchor for their identity and their historical presence in the city. Its image adorns homes, shops, and political posters throughout the Palestinian territories, representing not just a sacred site but a national and cultural emblem. The preservation of its Islamic character is a matter of paramount importance. Consequently, any perceived threat to the structure or the sanctuary on which it stands is met with fierce resistance, as it is seen as an attack on the very heart of their religious and national heritage in the Holy City. The Dome of the Rock also stands on the very ground where the Jewish temples once stood, creating a powerful and poignant juxtaposition of narratives. For some religious Jews, its presence is a painful reminder of their own loss and exile. For some Christian evangelicals, its eventual removal is a prophesied prerequisite for the building of a third temple and the second coming of Christ. These overlapping and conflicting beliefs place the beautiful shrine at the center of deeply held eschatological visions, adding another layer of religious tension to an already fraught political landscape. The serene beauty of the Dome of the Rock thus belies the complex and volatile histories that converge upon the sacred rock it protects. Located at the southern end of the Haram al-Sharif is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, whose name translates to the Farthermost Mosque. This title refers directly to the Quranic account of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, which describes him traveling from the sacred mosque in Mecca to the farthermost mosque before his ascension to heaven. While the current structure was built centuries after the Prophet's life, Muslims identify this location as the blessed destination of that journey, cementing its status as the third holiest site in Islam. Unlike the Dome of the Rock, which is a shrine, Al-Aqsa is a vast congregational mosque capable of holding thousands of worshippers for Friday prayers and other religious occasions. The mosque has a long and storied history, having been rebuilt and renovated numerous times following earthquakes and conquests. The current structure, with its large silver-leaded dome, is a composite of different architectural styles reflecting the various Islamic dynasties that have ruled Jerusalem. Its interior features a forest of ancient columns and a beautifully carved wooden pulpit, or minbar, a gift from the famous Muslim leader Saladin after he recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187. For centuries it has served as a major center for Islamic learning and jurisprudence, attracting scholars and students from across the Muslim world, and reinforcing Jerusalem's importance as a city of faith and knowledge. In the modern context, the Al-Aqsa Mosque has taken on a powerful political symbolism for the Palestinian national movement. The name Al-Aqsa is often used to refer to the entire compound of the Haram al-Sharif, and defending it has become a rallying cry for Palestinian resistance to the Israeli occupation. The mosque is frequently a flashpoint for clashes between Palestinian worshippers and Israeli security forces, especially during times of heightened political tension. Images of Israeli police entering the prayer hall are broadcast across the Arab and Muslim world, provoking widespread outrage and accusations that Israel is violating the sanctity of one of Islam's holiest sites. This politicization of the mosque has made it a central icon in the conflict. Palestinian political factions, including both the secular Fatah and the Islamist Hamas, frequently invoke the defense of Al-Aqsa to mobilize popular support. Groups of devout Muslims, known as Murabitun, have organized to maintain a constant presence on the compound, seeking to protect its Islamic character from what they see as encroachment by Jewish activists. For Palestinians, the struggle for control over Al-Aqsa is inseparable from their broader struggle for self-determination and sovereignty in East Jerusalem. The mosque is therefore not only a house of prayer but also a potent symbol of national identity and defiance. A short walk from the Western Wall and the Haram al-Sharif, within the Christian quarter of the Old City, lies the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. For hundreds of millions of Christians, this is the most sacred place on earth. The sprawling, ancient church is believed to be built over the two holiest sites in Christianity, Calvary or Golgotha, the hill where Jesus was crucified, and the tomb, or sepulchre, where he was buried, and from which he is believed to have been resurrected. For nearly 1,700 years, since its first construction by the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, this site has been the primary destination for Christian pilgrims from every corner of the globe. Upon entering the church, one is immediately enveloped by a sense of chaotic antiquity. The space is dark, cavernous, and confusing, a warren of chapels, crypts, and staircases, each marking a different event from the story of the Passion. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and incense, and the soundscape is a jumble of different liturgies being chanted simultaneously in Greek, Latin, Armenian, and other languages. There is no central authority or single design vision. Instead, the church is a patchwork of styles and traditions, reflecting its long and complex history of destruction, rebuilding, and most importantly, sectarian division among the very people who revere it. The governance of the church is a perfect metaphor for the layered and often fractious history of Jerusalem itself. Control is jealously guarded and divided among 6 different Christian denominations. The Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Armenian Apostolic churches are the main custodians, with smaller rites held by the Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopian Orthodox churches. These groups operate under a rigid and complex set of rules known as the status quo, an agreement established in the Ottoman era that dictates which group controls which part of the church and at what time. This arrangement is so sensitive that even minor disputes, such as moving a ladder or a chair, have erupted into physical brawls between monks. The most famous symbol of this sectarian paralysis is the immovable ladder, a simple wooden ladder that has rested on a ledge above the entrance since at least the mid-18th century. Because the ledge is considered common ground, no single denomination has the right to move the ladder, and so it has remained in place for centuries, a silent testament to the deep-seated divisions within Christendom. This almost chaotic coexistence, this fragile and often tense sharing of a single sacred space, offers a powerful parallel to the wider dynamics of Jerusalem. It demonstrates how deeply rooted communities can be bound together by a shared love for a place, while simultaneously being driven apart by their competing claims to it. Winding its way through the narrow streets of the Muslim quarter is the Via Dolorosa, Latin for the Way of Sorrow. This path is the traditional route that Jesus is believed to have walked carrying his cross from the place of his condemnation by Pontius Pilate to his crucifixion at Golgotha. For centuries, Christian pilgrims have traced this route as an act of devotion, stopping to pray at 14 stations of the cross, each one commemorating a specific event from Jesus' final journey. These stations are marked by small chapels or simple plaques on the walls, turning the bustling streets of the old city into a living, interactive sanctuary. Walking the Via Dolorosa today is a unique and often jarring experience. The path is not a quiet, contemplative walkway, but a crowded and noisy commercial street. The sacred stations are interspersed with souvenir shops, falafel stands, and the entrances to private homes. Pilgrims attempting to follow the path in prayerful contemplation must navigate through throngs of tourists, local residents going about their daily lives, and vendors loudly hawking their wares. This fusion of the sacred and the profane, the ancient and the modern, is quintessentially Jerusalem. It forces the pilgrim to find their moment of spiritual connection amidst the distractions and chaos of everyday life, a powerful lesson in itself. Every Friday afternoon, a procession led by Franciscan friars retraces the Via Dolorosa, a tradition that has been maintained for centuries. Groups of pilgrims from all over the world join this procession, many taking turns to carry a large wooden cross, their hymns and prayers mingling with the sounds of the city. For these believers, walking this path is a profound physical and spiritual experience. It is a way to connect viscerally with the suffering of Jesus, to feel the weight of the cross, and to participate directly in the central story of their faith. The stones under their feet are believed to have borne witness to the original event, imbuing the journey with immense power and meaning. The Via Dolorosa is a powerful example of how faith can transform a physical landscape. What would otherwise be an ordinary set of streets becomes, through the lens of belief, one of the most sacred pathways in the world. It also highlights the intricate layering of the city. The route passes directly through the heart of the Muslim quarter, a daily reminder of the interwoven nature of the communities here. Christian pilgrims walk their path of sorrow through a neighborhood that is home to thousands of Muslims, a living example of the complex side-by-side existence that defines the old city. The path itself becomes a testament to the city's ability to contain multiple, overlapping worlds within its ancient walls. Leaving the dense confines of Jerusalem, we travel south into the stark and breathtaking landscape of the Judean desert. Here, rising dramatically from the barren floor of the desert, is the formidable rock fortress of Masada. Perched atop an isolated plateau with sheer cliffs on all sides, Masada was originally developed as a palace fortress by Herod the Great in the 1st century BCE. He equipped it with storehouses, cisterns, and luxurious Roman-style bathhouses, creating an impregnable refuge in the heart of the wilderness. But it is not for its Herodian grandeur that Masada is remembered, it is for the dramatic and tragic events that took place there a century later. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, a small band of Jewish rebels known as the Zealots fled Jerusalem and took refuge in the abandoned fortress of Masada. From this stronghold they resisted the might of the Roman Empire for several years, the last holdouts of the Great Jewish Revolt. The Roman 10th Legion, determined to crush this final pocket of resistance, laid siege to the fortress. The archaeological evidence of this siege is still clearly visible today, including the remains of the Roman camps and the massive earthen ramp they constructed to breach Masada's walls, a testament to the empire's relentless military engineering. The story of Masada's fall is known to us primarily through the writings of the 1st century historian Flavius Josephus. According to his account, when the Jewish defenders realized that the Romans were about to break through their defenses, their leader, Eleazar ben Yair, delivered a powerful speech. He convinced his followers that it was better to die as free people than to be captured and live as slaves. Following his command, the 960 men, women, and children at Masada took their own lives, with the men first killing their families before taking their own. When the Romans finally stormed the fortress, they were met not with resistance, but with an eerie silence, and the bodies of the dead. For nearly 1,900 years, this dramatic story was largely forgotten, buried in the pages of Josephus's ancient texts. However, in the 20th century, with the rise of Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel, the story of Masada was rediscovered and powerfully resurrected. The archaeological excavations of the site in the 1960s, led by the famous Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin, captured the imagination of the new nation. The tale of the Zealots' final stand was transformed into a foundational myth for modern Israel, a powerful symbol of courage, defiance, and the determination to fight for freedom against overwhelming odds, no matter the cost. The story of Masada, whether historically precise in every detail or not, has been mythologized and woven into the very fabric of modern Israeli identity. For the fledgling state, surrounded by hostile neighbors and facing existential threats, the tale of the ancient Zealots provided a heroic narrative of national pride and sacrifice. The slogan "Masada shall not fall again" became a powerful rallying cry, encapsulating a national ethos of self-reliance and a grim determination to prevent another Jewish tragedy. It transformed a story of mass suicide into a symbol of ultimate freedom, the choice to die on one's own terms, rather than submit to subjugation. This powerful symbolism was institutionalized in Israeli culture for decades. For many years, new recruits of the Israel Defense Forces Armored Corps would conclude their training with a grueling nighttime climb up the snake path to the summit of Masada. There, in a dramatic torchlit ceremony at dawn, they would swear their oath of allegiance to the state, declaring, "Masada shall not fall again." This ritual directly linked the modern Israeli soldier to the ancient Jewish warrior, creating a continuous narrative of national defense stretching back 2 millennia. Although this specific ceremony is no longer a standard practice, Masada remains a hugely popular site for school trips and army educational programs. However, the meaning of Masada has also been a subject of debate within Israeli society. Some critics have questioned the glorification of mass suicide as a national ideal, arguing that it promotes a dangerous, all-or-nothing mentality and a preference for death over compromise. They point out that the Zealots of Masada ultimately failed, and that the survival of the Jewish people was ensured not by suicidal last stands, but by the rabbis who chose life and adaptation after the temple's destruction. This critique offers an alternative model of Jewish heroism, one based on resilience, intellectual creativity, and the preservation of life and tradition against all odds. Despite these debates, the fortress remains an incredibly powerful landmark. For most Israelis, and for many Jewish visitors from around the world, a visit to Masada is a deeply moving experience. To stand on the sun-baked plateau, to see the remains of the Zealots' simple living quarters and the opulent palaces of their enemy, and to look out over the vast, silent desert, is to feel a direct connection to a pivotal moment in Jewish history. It serves as a potent reminder of the price of freedom and the historical trauma of losing sovereignty. Masada's story therefore continues to resonate as a complex and powerful symbol of Jewish endurance and the modern Israeli commitment to never again. Traveling from the arid desert to the sparkling coast of the Mediterranean Sea, we arrive at the magnificent ruins of Caesarea Maritima. This ancient port city, located about halfway between modern Tel Aviv and Haifa, serves as a powerful reminder that the history of this land is far more layered and cosmopolitan than the modern conflict might suggest. Caesarea was not originally a Jewish or an Arab city. It was a monumental creation of the Roman Empire built by Herod the Great around 25 BCE and named in honor of his patron, Caesar Augustus. It was a marvel of Roman engineering and a symbol of Roman power in the province of Judea. Herod transformed a small, insignificant anchorage into one of the most impressive ports in the entire Roman world. He constructed a massive artificial harbor, protected by 2 enormous breakwaters, which was large enough to accommodate the biggest Roman cargo ships. The city itself was a showcase of classical architecture, complete with a grand Roman theater, a hippodrome for chariot races, pagan temples, and a sophisticated aqueduct system that brought fresh water from the distant Mount Carmel. For centuries, Caesarea served as the Roman capital of the province, the seat of its governors, including Pontius Pilate, and the headquarters of the Roman legions stationed in the region. The ruins of Caesarea tell a story of a multicultural and often turbulent past. It was a city with a diverse population of Romans, Greeks, Samaritans, and a significant Jewish community. This mix of cultures often led to tensions and violent clashes, which were among the sparks that ignited the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome. In Christian tradition, Caesarea is also a significant site. It was here that the Apostle Peter is said to have converted the Roman centurion Cornelius, the first Gentile to be baptized, and where the Apostle Paul was imprisoned for 2 years before being sent to Rome for trial. The city was a crucial hub in the early spread of Christianity from its Jewish origins into the wider Greco-Roman world. Exploring the sprawling archaeological park of Caesarea today is like walking through a history book written in stone. You can sit in the seats of the ancient theater, which is still used for concerts. Imagine the roar of the crowds at the Hippodrome, and marvel at the arches of the aqueduct stretching along the beach. The city serves as a crucial historical counterpoint to the narratives centered solely on Jerusalem. It reminds us that for long periods this land was an integral part of other powerful empires, a province whose destiny was shaped by forces emanating from Rome or later from Byzantium and Damascus. Caesarea's ruins are a testament to the land's complex imperial past, a history far grander and more varied than any single national story can contain. To balance the weight of ancient history, our journey now shifts to the vibrant, modern, and overwhelmingly secular energy of Tel Aviv. Founded in 1909 on the sand dunes north of the ancient port city of Jaffa, Tel Aviv was established as the first modern all-Jewish city. Its founders envisioned a clean, spacious European-style city, a stark contrast to the crowded and ancient quarters of other towns. The name itself, meaning Hill of Spring, was taken from the Hebrew title of Theodor Herzl's utopian novel, Altneuland, or Old New Land, symbolizing the Zionist dream of building a modern, progressive future, while reviving an ancient national past. From its humble beginnings, Tel Aviv grew rapidly, especially in the 1930s when it absorbed thousands of Jewish immigrants fleeing the rise of Nazism in Europe. Many of these immigrants were architects trained in the Bauhaus School of Design in Germany. They brought their modernist principles with them, and over just a few short years, they built thousands of buildings in this new style. Characterized by clean lines, functional design, and white plaster facades, this architectural collection became known as the White City. In 2003, UNESCO recognized the White City of Tel Aviv as a World Heritage Site, celebrating it as an outstanding example of modern urban planning and architecture. Today, Tel Aviv is the cultural and commercial heart of Israel. It is a bustling 24-hour city, renowned for its beautiful beaches, world-class restaurants, vibrant art scene, and energetic nightlife. It is the center of Israel's high-tech industry, often referred to as Silicon Wadi, and it projects an image of a confident, forward-looking, and cosmopolitan nation. For many Israelis, Tel Aviv represents the success of the Zionist project, the creation of a thriving, democratic, and prosperous Hebrew-speaking society. It stands as a symbol of the secular, liberal side of the Israeli identity, often in stark contrast to the religious and nationalist fervor associated with Jerusalem. Yet, even in this city dedicated to the future, history is never far away. The old city of Jaffa, with its thousands of years of history, has now been incorporated into the municipality of Tel Aviv-Yafo, creating a fascinating blend of old and new. While Tel Aviv represents the birth of a new Hebrew nation, Jaffa was, before 1948, a major Palestinian cultural and economic center. The juxtaposition of these two cities, the ancient Arab port and the modern Jewish metropolis, serves as a physical representation of the two narratives of this land. Tel Aviv is the symbol of Israeli creation and innovation, but its very existence is intertwined with the history and displacement that occurred in Jaffa and other Palestinian towns. Our final stop in this part of our journey takes us to a small, unassuming building on Rothschild Boulevard in the heart of Tel Aviv. This is Independence Hall, the former home of Tel Aviv's first mayor, Mayor Dizengoff, and the site where the State of Israel was declared. On May 14, 1948, just hours before the British mandate was set to expire, Jewish leaders from across the political spectrum gathered in what was then the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. The location was chosen in a hurry and kept secret until the last moment for fear of an attack by the British or Arab forces. Inside this modest hall, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, stood beneath a portrait of Theodor Herzl and read the Declaration of Independence. In a high-pitched voice filled with emotion, he proclaimed the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel. He spoke of the Jewish people's natural right to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations, in their own sovereign state. The ceremony was brief, lasting only 32 minutes, but its impact was momentous. For the Jewish people, it was the culmination of a 2,000-year-old dream and a direct response to the recent trauma of the Holocaust. The interior of Independence Hall has been preserved exactly as it was on that historic day. The simple chairs for the 200 invited guests are still arranged in rows, facing the stage where the signatories sat. Visitors can listen to a recording of the original ceremony, hearing Ben-Gurion's voice crack with emotion and the spontaneous, joyous singing of Hatikva, the national anthem that erupted at the end. The hall is not a grand monument but a humble and deeply moving space. It serves as a powerful reminder that the State of Israel was born not in a palace or a cathedral but in a small art museum, in a moment of great uncertainty and peril. This building is a landmark of profound significance for Israelis, representing the moment their national aspirations became a political reality. It is a symbol of self-determination, sovereignty, and the transition from a persecuted minority to a nation among nations. However, it is also essential to remember the dual perspective of this moment. While Jews celebrated the birth of their state, for Palestinians this same declaration marked the beginning of the Nakba, their catastrophe. The creation of Israel led directly to the 1948 war and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Independence Hall, therefore, stands as a landmark that encapsulates the central duality of this story. One people's moment of triumphant independence was inextricably linked to another people's moment of profound loss. To understand how the State of Israel came into being, we must first travel back to late 19th century Europe. This was a period of great upheaval, marked by the rise of nationalism, where people across the continent began to define themselves by a shared language, culture, and ethnicity, demanding their own independent states. It was within this climate that a new political movement was born among the Jewish people, Zionism. For centuries, the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, or Zion, had been a central tenet of their religious faith. It was a spiritual longing, a hope for messianic redemption expressed in daily prayers and yearly rituals. Zionism, however, transformed this ancient religious hope into a modern, secular political program. The movement was a direct response to the persistent and often violent anti-Semitism that Jewish communities faced in Europe. In Eastern Europe, particularly within the Russian Empire, Jews were confined to a region called the Pale of Settlement, and were subjected to discriminatory laws and brutal state-sanctioned mob attacks known as pogroms. Even in Western Europe, where Jews had been granted legal equality and had integrated into society, anti-Semitism was on the rise. This was epitomized by the Dreyfus Affair in France, where a Jewish army officer was falsely convicted of treason, fueling a wave of anti-Jewish sentiment. Many Jews began to conclude that assimilation was a failed project and that true safety and dignity could only be achieved through national self-determination. Zionism argued that the Jewish people were not just a religious group but a nation, and like any other nation, they deserved their own sovereign territory where they could live freely and securely. While a few early thinkers considered other locations, the overwhelming consensus was that this homeland had to be in their ancient ancestral land, Palestine. The movement sought to achieve this goal through practical means by encouraging Jewish immigration to Palestine, purchasing land for agricultural settlements, and reviving Hebrew as a modern spoken language. These early pioneers, driven by a mix of socialist ideals and nationalist fervor, aimed to create the foundations of a new Jewish society from the ground up. This nascent movement was small at first, dismissed by many as a fanciful dream. Most of the world's Jews did not subscribe to Zionism, with many religious Jews believing that a return to Zion should only happen with the coming of the Messiah, and many assimilated Western Jews feeling that their home was in the countries where they were citizens. However, the movement's founders were persistent, organizing, writing, and lobbying to gain international support for their cause. They were planting the seeds of an idea that, fueled by the catastrophic events of the 20th century, would eventually grow into a political reality, setting the stage for a monumental clash with the Arab population already living in the land they coveted. The political ideology of Zionism did not emerge in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of centuries of Jewish persecution, a long and painful history that provided the moral and emotional urgency for the creation of a national home. Since their dispersion by the Roman Empire nearly 2 millennia ago, Jewish communities had been a scattered minority in lands ruled by others. In Christian Europe, they were often scapegoated, accused of deicide, and subjected to forced conversions, expulsions, and massacres. They were frequently restricted to ghettos, barred from owning land, and limited to a narrow range of professions. This history created a deep-seated collective trauma and a powerful yearning for a place of safety and normalcy. The 19th century, while bringing emancipation and new opportunities for some Jews in Western Europe, also saw the birth of a new, more virulent form of anti-Semitism. This modern anti-Semitism was not just based on religious prejudice but was rooted in racist theories that defined Jews as an alien and inferior race, incapable of true loyalty to any nation. This ideology portrayed Jews as a corrupting influence on national life, blaming them for economic hardships and political instability. It was this racial anti-Semitism that would later form the basis of Nazi ideology, demonstrating that even legal equality did not guarantee social acceptance or physical security for the Jewish people. In Eastern Europe, the situation was far more dire. The pogroms in the Russian Empire at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries were brutal, organized riots against Jewish towns and villages. Mobs, often with the tacit approval of the authorities, would murder, rape, and plunder with impunity. These waves of violence led to a massive exodus of Jews from Eastern Europe. While millions fled to the United States and other parts of the world, a small but dedicated minority chose to go to Palestine, inspired by the Zionist vision. For them, the dream of a Jewish homeland was not an abstract political theory, but a desperate life-or-death necessity. This continuous history of persecution is the essential context for understanding the driving force behind Zionism. The movement's founders and followers were convinced that as long as Jews were a powerless minority dependent on the goodwill of host nations, they would never be safe. The only solution, they argued, was to reverse the course of history, to gather the exiles, and to re-establish Jewish sovereignty in their own land. This quest for a safe haven, a place where Jews could defend themselves and control their own destiny, became the central pillar of the Zionist project. It was a powerful and compelling argument that would gain immense global traction in the wake of the ultimate persecution, the Holocaust. While the ideas of Jewish nationalism were percolating in various intellectual circles, it was a charismatic and assimilated Austro-Hungarian journalist named Theodor Herzl who transformed Zionism into a coherent and dynamic international political movement. Herzl, a secular Jew from Budapest, was initially a firm believer in assimilation. His perspective was shattered while he was working as a correspondent in Paris, covering the Dreyfus Affair in 1894. Witnessing the mobs in the supposedly enlightened city of Paris chanting "Death to the Jews" convinced him that anti-Semitism was an inescapable feature of European society, and that the Jewish problem could not be solved by simply trying to fit in. He concluded that the only viable solution was a political one. In 1896, Herzl published a short but explosive pamphlet titled Der Judenstaat, or The Jewish State. In it, he laid out a practical and visionary plan for the creation of an independent Jewish nation. He argued that the Jewish question was a national question, not a religious or social one, and it could only be resolved by establishing a state recognized under international law. He detailed his vision for a modern progressive state complete with a constitution, a professional army, and a sophisticated economic structure. He proposed the creation of two key organizations, the Society of Jews to act as the political leadership, and the Jewish Company to manage the finances and logistics of mass immigration and settlement. Herzl's true genius lay in his organizational and diplomatic skills. He was a tireless advocate for his cause, traveling across Europe to meet with kings, sultans, and popes, seeking a political charter for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which was then under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. In 1897, he convened the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, bringing together Jewish delegates from 17 countries. This Congress was a pivotal moment, establishing the Zionist organization and creating a formal platform for the movement. After the Congress, Herzl famously wrote in his diary, "At Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years and certainly in 50, everyone will know it." Although Herzl died in 1904, long before his dream was realized, he had successfully laid the institutional groundwork for the future state. He had taken the disparate yearnings for a return to Zion and molded them into a modern, organized political force. He He gave the movement a clear goal, a practical strategy, and international visibility. He is now revered as the father of modern political Zionism, the visionary who dared to imagine a Jewish state into existence. His prophecy of achieving statehood within 50 years would prove to be remarkably accurate, as the State of Israel was declared in 1948, just over 50 years after that fateful Congress in Basel. The First World War dramatically redrew the map of the world, and for the Zionist movement it presented a critical opportunity. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled Palestine for 400 years, sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary against the Allied powers, including Great Britain. As the war progressed, Britain began to look for ways to secure its strategic interests in the Middle East, particularly the protection of the Suez Canal, its vital lifeline to India. At the same time, Zionist leaders in Britain, most notably Chaim Weizmann, a brilliant chemist who made significant contributions to the British war effort, were intensely lobbying the government for support. This lobbying effort culminated in one of the most consequential documents in modern Middle Eastern history, the Balfour Declaration. On November 2, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Lord Rothschild, a prominent leader of the British Jewish community. The letter stated that the British government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was a short statement, only 67 words long, but its impact was immense. For the first time, a major global power had officially endorsed the goals of the Zionist movement. It was a monumental diplomatic victory that gave the project international legitimacy. However, the declaration contained a crucial and fateful ambiguity. It also included a proviso stating that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. At the time, these non-Jewish communities constituted over 90% of the population. The declaration effectively made two competing promises in the same sentence. It promised a national home to a people who were mostly living elsewhere, while simultaneously promising to protect the rights of the indigenous majority population. The British government was attempting to reconcile the aspirations of Zionism with the rights of the Palestinian Arabs, setting the stage for a century of conflict over how to interpret these contradictory commitments. The motivations behind the Balfour Declaration were complex. They included a genuine sympathy for the Zionist cause among some British leaders, a strategic desire to secure a pro-British presence in the region, and a perhaps exaggerated belief in the power of world Jewry to influence the war effort, particularly in Russia and the United States. Regardless of the motives, the declaration fundamentally altered the political landscape. It provided the Zionist movement with the backing of the British Empire, which was on the verge of conquering Palestine from the Ottomans. For the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, however, the declaration was a profound betrayal, a document that promised away their homeland to another people without their consent. With the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, control of Palestine passed to Great Britain. In 1922, the newly formed League of Nations formalized this control by granting Britain a mandate for Palestine. This was part of a wider system where former Ottoman territories were entrusted to European powers, supposedly to guide them toward self-government. The mandate for Palestine was unique, however, because its text explicitly incorporated the language of the Balfour Declaration. Its primary stated purpose was to facilitate the establishment of the Jewish national home, while also safeguarding the rights of the rest of the population. Britain was now legally bound to fulfill two seemingly irreconcilable goals. The British Mandate period, which lasted from 1922 to 1948, was a time of profound transformation for Palestine. The British established a modern infrastructure, building roads, ports, and government institutions. For the Zionist movement, the mandate was a golden opportunity. Under the protection of British rule, Jewish institutions flourished. The Jewish Agency was established as a quasi-government, managing immigration, settlement, and education. The Hebrew University was founded in Jerusalem, and a vibrant Jewish economy began to develop, particularly in the new, rapidly growing city of Tel Aviv. The Jewish population grew significantly during this period, fueled by waves of immigration from Europe. For the Palestinian Arabs, the Mandate period was one of growing fear and resentment. They viewed the British as a colonial power that was actively promoting the Zionist project at their expense. They saw their country being transformed before their eyes, with their land being sold to Jewish organizations and their demographic majority slowly eroding. They rejected the premise of the mandate, arguing that they were not a community whose rights needed safeguarding, but a nation that deserved independence. They organized politically, led by figures like the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, demanding an end to Jewish immigration, a ban on land sales, and the establishment of an independent Arab government. Caught between these two competing national movements, British policy in Palestine was often inconsistent and contradictory. They tried to balance their commitments, sometimes tilting in favor of the Zionists, and at other times trying to appease the Arabs. They issued white papers that attempted to limit Jewish immigration and land purchases, which angered the Jews, while simultaneously suppressing Arab revolts, which enraged the Arabs. Britain found itself trapped in an impossible situation, unable to satisfy either side. The Mandate period became a low-grade civil war, a time of escalating violence and deepening distrust that set the stage for the all-out conflict that would erupt as soon as the British departed. The British Mandate period was defined by successive waves of Jewish immigration, known in Hebrew as Aliyah, which means ascent or going up to the land of Israel. Each wave brought immigrants from different parts of the world with different ideologies, all contributing to the growth of the Jewish community, or Yishuv, in Palestine. The third and fourth Aliyahs in the 1920s brought tens of thousands of pioneers from Eastern Europe, many driven by socialist ideals, and instrumental in establishing the kibbutz and moshav, the collective agricultural settlements that became iconic symbols of the Zionist enterprise. They drained swamps, cultivated the land, and built the foundations of a new Hebrew-speaking society. The most significant wave was the fifth Aliyah, which took place in the 1930s. This wave was driven by the rise of Nazism in Germany and growing anti-Semitism across Europe. Unlike the earlier, more ideologically driven pioneers, the immigrants of the Fifth Aliyah were often middle-class professionals, doctors, lawyers, and academics fleeing persecution. They brought with them capital, skills, and a more urban sensibility, contributing to the rapid growth of cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa. This influx of over 250,000 immigrants dramatically altered the demographic balance of Palestine, more than doubling the Jewish population and causing immense alarm among the Arab community. From the Palestinian Arab perspective, this mass immigration was nothing short of a demographic invasion. They watched as the Jewish population swelled from less than 10% of the total in 1918 to around 30% by the mid-1930s. They feared becoming a minority in their own homeland. Jewish land purchases, often from absentee landlords, resulted in the displacement of Arab tenant farmers, creating a landless and dispossessed class that became a source of social and political unrest. The growing economic power of the Yishuv, with its separate institutions and policy of hiring only Jewish labor, further deepened the divide between the two communities. The rising tensions frequently erupted into violence. Major riots broke out in 1921 and 1929, with brutal attacks on Jewish communities in Hebron and Safed. Each side developed its own paramilitary organizations for self-defense and offensive operations. The Zionists formed the Haganah, which would later become the core of the Israeli army, as well as radical underground groups like the Irgun and Lehi. The Arabs also formed armed bands to attack Jewish settlements and British targets. The land was becoming increasingly polarized, a pressure cooker of competing nationalisms with the British Mandate authorities struggling to keep the lid on. By the mid-1930s, Palestinian Arab frustration had reached a boiling point. The combination of continued mass Jewish immigration, expanding land sales, and the clear failure of political appeals to the British led to a widespread sense of desperation. In 1936, this frustration exploded into a full-scale three-year uprising known as the Great Arab Revolt. It began as a general strike organized by a new body, the Arab Higher Committee, which demanded an end to Jewish immigration, a prohibition on land transfers to Jews, and the establishment of an independent national government. The strike soon escalated into a major armed rebellion against both the British Mandate and the Zionist project. The revolt was a protracted and brutal conflict. Arab guerrilla fighters based in the hills and villages attacked British military patrols, sabotaged infrastructure like oil pipelines and railways, and launched attacks on Jewish settlements and transportation. The British responded with overwhelming force and harsh counterinsurgency tactics. They imposed collective punishments on villages, conducted mass arrests, and demolished the homes of suspected rebels. The Jaffa port was largely destroyed by the British to create clear lines of fire. thousands of Palestinians were killed, and much of their leadership was either arrested, killed, or forced into exile, leaving the Palestinian community shattered and disorganized by the time the revolt was crushed in 1939. The revolt had a profound and lasting impact on all three parties. For the Palestinians, it was a national catastrophe. While it demonstrated their fierce opposition to the Zionist enterprise, its failure left them politically and militarily crippled on the eve of the crucial 1948 war. The internal dynamics of the revolt also saw significant infighting among rival Palestinian clans, further weakening their society. For the British, the revolt was a clear signal that the mandate was untenable. The cost in blood and treasure was too high, and they began actively searching for a way to extricate themselves from Palestine. They issued the 1939 White Paper, which severely restricted Jewish immigration, effectively abandoning the Balfour Declaration's promise just as Europe's Jews needed a haven the most. For the Zionist movement, the Arab Revolt was a formative experience. It convinced them that they could not rely on the British for protection, and that a powerful independent military force was essential for their survival. The Haganah was transformed from a loose collection of defense units into a more centralized and professional fighting force. The revolt also spurred the Yishuv to develop greater economic self-sufficiency, creating a state within a state that was ready to step into the vacuum when the British eventually left. The revolt, therefore, was the first major armed clash between the two national movements, a dress rehearsal for the larger war that was to come, and a clear demonstration that there was no middle ground to be found. As the Arab Revolt was being crushed in Palestine, the darkest chapter in Jewish history was beginning to unfold in Europe. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany in 1933 unleashed a systematic campaign of persecution that would culminate in the Holocaust, the genocide of 6 million European Jews. This event, unprecedented in its industrial scale and bureaucratic efficiency, had a profound and irreversible impact on the Jewish people and the world. It stands as the ultimate and most horrific proof of what can happen to a people who are stateless and powerless, a specter that haunts the Jewish psyche to this day. During the late 1930s, as Nazi persecution intensified, the doors of the world were closing to Jewish refugees. The infamous 1939 British White Paper, issued in an attempt to appease the Arabs after their revolt, severely limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to just 75,000 over 5 years, at the very moment when a safe haven was most desperately needed. Ships filled with Jewish refugees fleeing for their lives were turned away from Palestine and other countries, often forced to return to Nazi-occupied Europe and certain death. This policy is viewed by many Israelis as a profound betrayal by the British, a moral failure of catastrophic proportions that sealed the fate of millions. The sheer horror of the Holocaust, which became fully known to the world at the end of World War II with the liberation of the concentration camps, created an undeniable global urgency for a solution to the Jewish question. The images of emaciated survivors, the piles of bodies, and the gas chambers shocked the conscience of the world. The argument of the Zionist movement that the Jewish people needed a state of their own to ensure their survival was no longer an abstract political theory. It had become a pressing moral imperative. For many in the international community, supporting the creation of a Jewish state was seen as a necessary act of atonement for the world's failure to prevent the genocide. The Holocaust reshaped the Zionist movement itself. Hundreds of thousands of survivors who had lost everything and everyone had nowhere to go. For them, the only conceivable future was in a Jewish homeland. They became the most powerful and compelling advocates for statehood. The Holocaust also created a hardened resolve within the Jewish community in Palestine. The idea of never again became a core tenet of their identity, a vow that Jews would never again be led helplessly to the slaughter. This grim determination fueled a more militant and uncompromising struggle against the British, as underground groups intensified their attacks to force Britain out of Palestine and open the gates to the survivors. By 1947, Great Britain had reached its breaking point. Exhausted by World War II, facing a violent Jewish insurgency, and unable to find a solution that was acceptable to both Arabs and Jews, the British government decided to hand the problem of Palestine over to the newly formed United Nations. The UN created a special committee, UNSCOP, to investigate the situation and propose a solution. After months of hearings and fact-finding missions, the committee concluded, as the British had, that the national aspirations of Jews and Arabs in Palestine were irreconcilable. The majority of the committee members recommended the termination of the British Mandate and the partition of the land into two separate states. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on Resolution 181, the Partition Plan. The plan called for the division of Palestine into an independent Arab state, an independent Jewish state, and a special international regime for the city of Jerusalem. The proposed Jewish state would consist of the coastal plain, the eastern Galilee, and the Negev desert, comprising about 56% of the land. The Arab state would include the central hill country, the western Galilee, and the southern coast, including what is now the Gaza Strip. The two states were to be linked in an economic union. The plan was a complex and imperfect compromise, an attempt to draw lines on a map that reflected the demographic realities as best as possible. The reaction to the vote was immediate and starkly divided. The Jewish leadership, led by David Ben-Gurion, accepted the plan. While they were disappointed with some of the proposed borders and the internationalization of Jerusalem, they saw the plan as a historic opportunity to achieve their long-held dream of sovereignty. It provided them with international legitimacy for statehood. Across the Jewish world and in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the vote was met with massive celebrations, dancing, and joyous tears. For them, it was the moment the world had finally recognized their right to a state of their own after 2 millennia of statelessness. The Arab world, however, vehemently rejected the partition plan. The Palestinian Arab leadership and the surrounding Arab states saw it as a catastrophic injustice. They argued that the UN, a body dominated by Western powers, had no right to partition their country and give more than half of it to a minority population that, even after years of immigration, still owned less than 10% of the land. They viewed the plan as the culmination of the colonial project that began with the Balfour Declaration. The rejection was absolute. As soon as the vote was passed, violence erupted throughout Palestine. The passing of the resolution did not bring peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of the civil war that would escalate into the full-scale war of 1948. The period between the UN partition vote in November 1947 and the end of the British Mandate in May 1948 was one of escalating civil war. As British forces began to withdraw, a power vacuum emerged, and Jewish and Arab militias battled fiercely for control of territory, roads, and strategic positions. The Jewish forces, better organized and more centralized, began to gain the upper hand, launching a series of military operations to secure the areas allocated to them by the partition plan, and to create contiguous control over their territory. This period saw intense fighting and significant displacement of civilians on both sides, setting a brutal precedent for the war to come. As the final day of the British Mandate, May 14, 1948, approached, the Jewish leadership faced a momentous decision. The United States, fearing a wider regional war, was pressuring them to postpone declaring statehood. The armies of the surrounding Arab states were massing on the borders, promising a full-scale invasion the moment the state was declared. The situation was perilous. Despite the immense risks, David Ben-Gurion and the majority of the leadership were convinced that this was a historic opportunity that could not be missed. They decided to proceed, to seize the moment and declare the establishment of the state. On the afternoon of May 14, 1948, in a small hall in the Tel Aviv Museum, David Ben-Gurion stood before the assembled leaders of the Jewish community and read Israel's Declaration of Independence. The document recounted the long history of the Jewish people, their connection to the land, their persecution, the Holocaust, and their undeniable right to self-determination. It declared the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel, to be known as the State of Israel. It promised that the new state would be based on the principles of liberty, justice, and peace, that it would ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. And it extended a hand of peace to all neighboring Arab states. The declaration was a moment of profound triumph and historical fulfillment for the Jewish people. It marked the culmination of the Zionist dream, the realization of 2,000 years of prayer and a 50-year political struggle. The sound of Ben-Gurion's voice proclaiming the state, followed by the emotional singing of the national anthem, Hatikva, or the Hope, symbolized the rebirth of Jewish sovereignty. However, This moment of birth was also a moment of immense peril. The new state was born into a war for its very survival. The ink on the declaration was barely dry when the armies of 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon and Iraq, invaded, determined to crush the infant state at its inception. The invasion by the surrounding Arab armies transformed the ongoing civil war in Palestine into a full-scale international conflict, the first Arab-Israeli war. For the newly established state of Israel, this was their war of independence. They were fighting for their very existence against what seemed like overwhelming odds. The fledgling Israel Defense Forces, forged from the Haganah and other underground militias, was outnumbered and poorly equipped at the outset. The war was a desperate, bloody struggle, with high casualties on both sides. The Israelis fought with a fierce determination, believing that defeat would mean another Holocaust, a complete annihilation. From the Palestinian perspective and that of the wider Arab world, this was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. The war resulted in a crushing military defeat and a profound national trauma from which they have never fully recovered. The Arab armies, despite their numerical superiority, were poorly coordinated and plagued by internal rivalries. The Israeli forces, fighting for their homes and their lives, proved to be a more cohesive and motivated military. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel had not only survived but had expanded its territory to include about 78% of Mandate Palestine, significantly more than the 56% allocated by the UN partition plan. The human cost of the war was immense, and its most lasting legacy was the creation of the Palestinian refugee crisis. During the fighting, over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, more than half of the Arab population of Mandate Palestine, fled or were expelled from their homes in the territory that became Israel. The causes of this mass exodus are still fiercely debated by historians. Israelis have traditionally emphasized that the Palestinians left on the orders of their own leaders or fled the fighting voluntarily. Palestinians, supported by a new generation of Israeli historians, point to a pattern of expulsions, military attacks, and psychological warfare by Israeli forces designed to encourage flight. The reality was likely a complex mix of all these factors. The end of the war did not bring peace, but an entrenched state of hostility. The planned Arab state in Palestine never came into existence. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was occupied and later annexed by Jordan, while the Gaza Strip came under Egyptian military administration. The 700,000 Palestinian refugees were scattered in camps in these territories and in neighboring Arab countries, where the vast majority of their descendants remain to this day. Israel refused to allow the refugees to return, fearing they would destabilize the new Jewish state. This single event, with its 2 vastly different names, the War of Independence and the Nakba, is the seismic event that created the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a story of one nation's birth and another's devastation. To fully comprehend the Palestinian experience, we must now delve deeper into the seismic event that defines their modern history, the Nakba. This Arabic word meaning catastrophe or disaster refers to the profound trauma of the 1948 war, a conflict that resulted not only in military defeat but in the shattering of Palestinian society and the dispossession of a people from their homeland. For Palestinians, the Nakba is not a single, finished event that occurred in 1948. Instead, it is understood as a continuous and ongoing process of displacement, occupation and denial of national rights that persists to this very day. It is the foundational wound from which so many of the subsequent grievances and conflicts have grown, a collective memory of loss that shapes every aspect of their identity. The scale of the Nakba was immense. During the 1948 war, more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, constituting over half of the Arab population of the territory, were uprooted from their homes. They fled from the terror of battle, were driven by direct military orders from Israeli forces, or were compelled to leave by a growing atmosphere of fear and panic. Over 400 Palestinian villages and towns were depopulated and subsequently destroyed or resettled by Jewish immigrants. This systematic erasure of the Palestinian presence from the landscape was a deliberate effort to solidify the new Jewish state and prevent any possibility of the refugees returning. The physical destruction of homes, mosques and cemeteries was an attempt to erase not just the people, but their history from the land. This mass displacement is the central pillar of the Palestinian narrative. The story of the Nakba is passed down through generations, often symbolized by the key to a lost family home, a potent emblem of both memory and the enduring hope of return. This experience of dispossession created a shared identity among Palestinians, uniting them in a common sense of injustice and a collective demand for redress. The right of return, the principle that Palestinian refugees and their descendants have a right to go back to the homes and lands they lost in 1948, became the most sacred and non-negotiable demand of the Palestinian national movement, a right enshrined in UN General Assembly Resolution 194. For Israel, the concept of the Palestinian right of return poses an existential threat. The influx of millions of Palestinian refugees, they argue, would fundamentally alter the demographic character of the state, effectively ending its identity as a Jewish homeland. This clash over the Nakba's legacy lies at the very heart of the conflict's intractability. One people's story of national liberation is inseparable from another story of national catastrophe. Acknowledging the reality and the pain of the Nakba is not merely a historical exercise. It is a crucial step in understanding the deep-seated fears and aspirations that continue to drive the Palestinian struggle for statehood and self-determination in the face of enduring loss. The end of the 1948 war did not resolve the fate of the 700,000 displaced Palestinians. It solidified their status as refugees. They found themselves scattered across the region, huddled in makeshift camps in the newly Jordanian-controlled West Bank, the Egyptian-administered Gaza Strip, and in the neighboring countries of Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. They believed their exile would be temporary, that once the fighting subsided, they would be allowed to return to their homes and villages. This belief was reinforced by the international community, which passed UN Resolution 194 calling for their return. However, the new state of Israel, facing its own immense challenges of security and absorbing Jewish refugees from Arab lands, was resolute in its refusal to allow them back. The Israeli government passed a series of laws, such as the Absentees Property Law, which transferred the land and homes of the refugees to state ownership. This legislation effectively legalized the dispossession and created a permanent barrier to their return. The villages they had left behind were systematically bulldozed, forested over by the Jewish National Fund, or replaced with new Israeli towns and agricultural settlements. This transformation of the landscape was a deliberate strategy to create new facts on the ground, making the pre-1948 map of Palestine unrecognizable and the prospect of return a practical impossibility. For the refugees watching from afar, it was a painful and final severing of their connection to their ancestral land. The United Nations responded to the humanitarian crisis by creating a new agency, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA. Established in 1949, UNRWA was intended as a temporary organization to provide emergency relief, food, shelter, and basic services to the displaced population. However, as the political stalemate dragged on, and the refugees were unable to return, UNRWA's mandate evolved. It became a semi-permanent provider of essential services, running schools, health clinics, and social programs in the refugee camps. For over 70 years, UNRWA has been a lifeline for millions, but its very existence is a testament to the international community's failure to find a just and lasting political solution. The refugee crisis born in 1948 has only grown over time. The original population of 700,000 has now swelled to nearly 6 million registered refugees, including their descendants. This status is passed down from one generation to the next, creating a unique inherited identity of statelessness. The refugee camps, which began as temporary tent cities, have morphed into dense, impoverished, and permanent urban neighborhoods. The conditions in these camps, combined with the lack of political rights and economic opportunities, created a fertile ground for resentment, political activism, and the eventual rise of armed resistance movements dedicated to the liberation of Palestine and the fulfillment of the right of return. Life in the refugee camps became the defining experience for a huge portion of the Palestinian people. What were once temporary collections of tents slowly transformed into permanent, densely packed neighborhoods of concrete block shelters, threaded with narrow, unpaved alleyways. Overcrowding, inadequate infrastructure, and high rates of poverty and unemployment became the chronic conditions of camp life. These camps, administered by UNRWA, but often located within the jurisdiction of host countries that granted few rights to the refugees, became worlds unto themselves. They were spaces of waiting, suspended between a lost past and an uncertain future, where generation after generation was born into the status of a refugee. Despite the hardship, the camps also became crucibles of Palestinian national identity and political consciousness. In the absence of a state, the social fabric of the lost villages was often recreated within the camps. People from the same village would cluster together, maintaining their distinct dialects, customs, and social networks. The camp became a living museum of pre-1948 Palestine, a place where the memory of the homeland was kept alive through stories, songs, and the names of neighborhoods and streets, which were often named after the villages from which the inhabitants had been displaced. This preservation of memory was a form of cultural resistance against the erasure of their past. The camps were also highly politicized environments. The shared experience of dispossession and the daily struggles of life under difficult conditions fostered a strong sense of collective grievance and solidarity. Political factions found fertile ground for recruitment, turning the camps into centers of activism and, eventually, armed struggle. The walls of the camps became canvases for political murals, posters of martyrs, and graffiti calling for liberation and return. The schools run by UNRWA, while providing essential education, also produced a generation of politically aware and often radicalized young Palestinians who were determined to change their circumstances through direct action rather than waiting for international diplomacy. This identity forged in exile was fundamentally different from that of a citizen of a sovereign state. It was an identity defined by loss, by statelessness, and by the collective aspiration for return. The camp experience created a powerful sense of unity among Palestinians, whether they were in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, or Syria. It transcended geographical boundaries, linking them together in a shared struggle. This potent mix of memory, hardship, and political fervor that characterized life in the camps would ultimately fuel the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization and place the refugee issue at the absolute center of the Palestinian national cause for decades to come. The 1949 armistice agreements that ended the 1948 war did not create a Palestinian state as envisioned by the UN partition plan. Instead, the territory that had been allocated for the Arab state was carved up and brought under the control of its neighbors. The largest portion, the mountainous central region that became known as the West Bank, along with the old city of East Jerusalem, was occupied and subsequently annexed by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The small, densely populated coastal territory of the Gaza Strip was placed under Egyptian military administration. The Palestinian people found themselves living under either Israeli, Jordanian, or Egyptian rule, their own aspirations for an independent state completely denied. Under Jordanian rule, the Palestinians of the West Bank were granted Jordanian citizenship, a move that integrated the territory politically and administratively into the kingdom. However, this integration was not without tension. Many Palestinians felt that the Jordanian regime, based in Amman, prioritized the interests of its original East Bank population, and sought to suppress any independent Palestinian political organizing. The term Palestinian was often discouraged in favor of a unified Jordanian identity. While they had passports and could travel, they lacked genuine national self-determination, and the dream of a sovereign Palestinian state was actively discouraged by the authorities who now governed them. The situation in the Gaza Strip was even more precarious. The territory was flooded with refugees, who at one point made up more than 2/3 of the population. Unlike Jordan, Egypt never annexed Gaza or granted its residents Egyptian citizenship. The Palestinians in Gaza were kept under a strict military administration, their movement was heavily restricted, and they were left effectively stateless. This isolation and lack of political rights made Gaza a hotbed of political ferment and resistance. It was from the refugee camps of Gaza that the first cross-border raids or Fedayeen attacks into Israel were launched in the 1950s, prompting harsh Israeli military reprisals and establishing a cycle of violence that would characterize the area for decades. For the nearly 2 decades between 1949 and 1967, the Palestinian people were a nation without a state, fragmented and living under the control of others. The Palestinian question was largely seen by the international community as a refugee problem to be managed, not a national question requiring a political solution. The Arab states paid lip service to the Palestinian cause but often prioritized their own national interests. It was in this political vacuum, out of the frustration and desperation of a generation that had grown up in exile and under foreign administration, that a new, independent Palestinian national movement would finally emerge, determined to take control of its own destiny. By the early 1960s, a new generation of Palestinians had come of age. Disillusioned with the failure of the Arab states to liberate their homeland, and frustrated with their own lack of political representation, they concluded that Palestinians had to take the lead in their own struggle. This sentiment led to the formation of numerous underground political and paramilitary groups. The most prominent of these was Fatah, a reverse acronym for the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, founded in the late 1950s by a group of young activists, including a charismatic engineering student named Yasser Arafat. Fatah's core belief was that the liberation of Palestine could only be achieved through armed struggle waged by Palestinians themselves. In 1964, under the auspices of the Arab League, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, was formed. Initially, it was created by the Arab states, particularly Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, as a way to control and channel Palestinian nationalism. Its first leader was a veteran diplomat, Ahmad Shukayri, who was seen as compliant with Arab state interests. However, after the devastating Arab defeat in the 1967 Six-Day War, the credibility of the Arab regimes was shattered, and the independent guerrilla factions, led by Fatah, rose to prominence. In 1969, Yasser Arafat took over the chairmanship of the PLO, transforming it from a puppet organization into the primary vehicle of the Palestinian national movement. Under Arafat's leadership, the PLO became an umbrella organization, uniting the various Palestinian factions from the mainstream Fatah to more radical Marxist groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP. The PLO established itself as a government-in-exile, creating departments for health, education, and social welfare, and operating a network of embassies and diplomatic missions around the world. Its primary tool, however, was armed struggle. The PLO launched attacks against Israeli targets, both military and civilian, from its bases in Jordan and later Lebanon. These attacks, which included controversial and brutal acts of terrorism such as airplane hijackings, brought the Palestinian cause to the world's attention, albeit in a bloody and polarizing manner. The PLO's actions succeeded in putting the Palestinians back on the political map. They were no longer just a refugee problem, they were a national movement demanding statehood. In 1974, the Arab League declared the PLO to be the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, a major diplomatic victory. Later that year, Yasser Arafat was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly, where he famously declared, "Today I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." The PLO had successfully established itself as the internationally recognized voice of the Palestinian people, a status it would hold for decades as it navigated the turbulent politics of the Middle East. The year 1967 marked the most significant turning point in the conflict since 1948. In the spring of that year, tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors escalated dramatically. Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser, under pressure to demonstrate Arab strength, blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's southern port of Eilat. He also expelled United Nations peacekeeping forces from the Sinai Peninsula and moved his own troops to the border. Faced with bellicose rhetoric from Arab leaders and believing an attack was imminent, Israel decided to launch a preemptive strike. On the morning of June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the bulk of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, ensuring Israeli air superiority for the rest of the war. The conflict, which became known as the Six-Day War, was a stunning and comprehensive military victory for Israel. In just 6 days of fighting, Israel achieved what seemed impossible. On the southern front, Israeli forces swept across the Sinai Peninsula, reaching the Suez Canal. On the eastern front, after Jordan entered the war and began shelling West Jerusalem, Israeli troops counterattacked, capturing the entire West Bank, and, most significantly, the Old City of Jerusalem. The emotional images of Israeli paratroopers reaching the Western Wall for the first time in 19 years became an iconic symbol of the victory. On the northern front, Israel captured the strategic Golan Heights from Syria. the war fundamentally redrew the map of the Middle East and the dynamics of the conflict. Israel, a small and vulnerable-feeling state, was transformed overnight into the region's dominant military power, now in control of territory more than 3 times its original size. The victory was met with euphoria and a sense of messianic deliverance within Israel. The reunification of Jerusalem and the capture of the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, were seen by many religious Israelis as a miraculous fulfillment of divine promise. The war instilled a new sense of confidence and security, but it also presented Israel with a profound and enduring dilemma: what to do with the newly conquered territories and the million Palestinians who lived there. For the Palestinians, the Six-Day War was a second Nakba, another devastating defeat that brought a new and more direct form of suffering. The war created a new wave of refugees, with an estimated 300,000 Palestinians fleeing or being expelled from the West Bank to Jordan. More importantly, the entire Palestinian population of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, who had been living under Jordanian and Egyptian rule, now found themselves living under Israeli military occupation. This direct occupation would become the central feature of the conflict for the next half-century, shaping the daily lives of millions of Palestinians and creating a new and more intimate phase of the struggle for statehood. Following the swift victory of the Six-Day War, Israel was faced with governing a large hostile Palestinian population in the newly captured territories of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. The Israeli government established a military administration to rule these areas, beginning a military occupation that more than 50 years later has yet to end. This was intended to be a temporary situation, with the common Israeli view being that the territories were a bargaining chip, land for peace, that could be traded back to the Arab states in exchange for formal recognition and a comprehensive peace treaty. This belief was encapsulated in the famous United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, which called for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the recent conflict in exchange for secure and recognized borders. However, the peace that many expected did not materialize. The Arab states, meeting in Khartoum later in 1967, famously issued their 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. This diplomatic stalemate meant that the temporary occupation began to calcify, becoming a long-term reality. The Israeli military became the de facto government for millions of Palestinians, controlling every aspect of their lives. A complex system of military orders, permits, and regulations was put in place, governing everything from building a house and traveling between cities, to farming one's own land and engaging in political activity. Daily life for Palestinians under occupation became a constant struggle with a foreign military power. Checkpoints were established on roads, restricting movement and turning simple commutes into lengthy, humiliating ordeals. The Israeli security services, the Shin Bet, maintained a pervasive presence, monitoring the population, recruiting collaborators, and carrying out arrests, often in the middle of the night. Palestinians could be subjected to administrative detention, held for months or even years without charge or trial. Their homes could be demolished as a punitive measure if a family member was suspected of involvement in an attack. This system created a pervasive atmosphere of fear, powerlessness, and resentment. The occupation created a relationship of profound inequality. On one side was the occupier, the Israeli military, with its absolute power and advanced weaponry. On the other side was the occupied, the Palestinian population, who were stateless, denied basic political rights, and subject to the arbitrary will of a foreign army. This dynamic of control and resistance became the defining feature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from 1967 onwards. The occupation was no longer an abstract political issue. It was a daily, grinding reality that fueled a deep and abiding desire for liberation and an end to foreign rule, setting the stage for decades of resistance, both violent and non-violent. Shortly after the 1967 war, a new and highly consequential phenomenon began to emerge: the Israeli settlement movement. Initially, the Israeli government established a few strategic settlements in the Jordan Valley and the Golan Heights for security purposes. However, a different kind of movement soon took hold, one driven not by security strategy but by religious and nationalist ideology. A powerful and highly motivated group of religious Zionists, known as Gush Emunim, or the Block of the Faithful, came to believe that the capture of the West Bank, the biblical lands of Judea and Samaria, was a divine miracle. They saw it as their religious duty to settle these lands and make them an inseparable part of the land of Israel. This settler movement began to establish facts on the ground, often defying the government's official policy by setting up small, unauthorized outposts on hilltops deep within the West Bank. Over time, successive Israeli governments, particularly those led by the right-wing Likud party, began to actively support and encourage the settlement enterprise. They provided funding, infrastructure, and military protection for the new communities, viewing them as a way to solidify Israel's control over the territories and prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. What began as a fringe movement became a major national project, with settlements growing from small collections of trailers into large suburban towns with schools, shopping centers, and industrial parks. From the Palestinian and international perspective, these settlements are a grave violation of international law. The Fourth Geneva Convention, which governs military occupations, explicitly prohibits an occupying power from transferring its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. The settlements are seen as the primary obstacle to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. They are strategically placed to break up the contiguity of Palestinian population centers, carving up the West Bank into a series of disconnected cantons and making the creation of a viable, independent Palestinian state on that land practically impossible. The settlements and the network of separate roads built to connect them create a two-tiered system of law and infrastructure in the same territory. The presence of over 500,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem has created a landscape of permanent conflict. It necessitates a massive Israeli military presence to protect the settlers, leading to constant friction with the local Palestinian population. Clashes over land, water resources, and access to roads are a daily occurrence. The settler movement has created a powerful political lobby within Israel that fiercely opposes any withdrawal from the territories. By creating these irreversible facts on the ground, the settlement project has fundamentally altered the very nature of the conflict, transforming it from a dispute over borders to a struggle for control of the land itself. After about 2 decades of occupation, Palestinian frustration and anger, well, they finally reached a breaking point. In December 1987, a traffic accident in the Gaza Strip, where an Israeli army truck crashed into a car and killed 4 Palestinian laborers, became the spark that ignited a massive popular uprising. This uprising came to be known as the First Intifada, which is an Arabic word meaning shaking off. It was fundamentally different from previous forms of Palestinian resistance. Unlike before, it was not led by the PLO leadership in exile or by organized guerrilla factions. Instead, it was a spontaneous grassroots rebellion that erupted from within the occupied territories themselves, drawing in all sectors of Palestinian society. The most defining images of the First Intifada were not of armed commandos, but of Palestinian youths, their faces often wrapped in keffiyehs, throwing stones at heavily armed Israeli soldiers. The uprising was marked by widespread civil disobedience, mass protests, general strikes, boycotts of Israeli products, and a refusal to pay taxes to the Israeli military administration. A new, underground local leadership emerged to coordinate the uprising's activities, showing a remarkable capacity for community organizing. The Intifada sent a powerful message to Israel and to the world. The Palestinian people would no longer passively accept the occupation. They were determined to resist it through collective action. Israel, honestly, was caught completely by surprise and struggled to find an effective response. The defense minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, famously ordered the army to break their bones in an attempt to quell the protests. The Israeli military responded to the stone throwing with tear gas, rubber bullets, and often live ammunition, which resulted in hundreds of Palestinian deaths and thousands of injuries. The stark, televised images of heavily armed soldiers confronting unarmed teenagers created a public relations disaster for Israel. For the first time, the world began to see the conflict not as a war between armies, but as a struggle between a powerful military occupier and a disenfranchised people demanding their freedom. The First Intifada fundamentally changed the political landscape. It shattered the illusion that the occupation was benign or manageable. It demonstrated to the Israeli public and leadership that the status quo was unsustainable and came at a high moral and political cost. For the Palestinians, the Intifada restored a sense of agency and pride, proving that they could challenge the occupation from within. It also shifted the center of gravity of the Palestinian national movement from the PLO leadership in exile to the people living in the territories. This new reality forced both sides as well as the international community to recognize that a political solution was necessary. Ultimately, this paved the way for the first direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. The First Intifada, along with the shifting geopolitical landscape after the end of the Cold War and the 1991 Gulf War, created a new opening for diplomacy. For the first time ever, secret direct negotiations took place between Israeli officials and the PLO leadership. These clandestine talks, facilitated by the Norwegian government in the city of Oslo, led to a historic breakthrough. In September 1993, on the lawn of the White House in Washington, D.C., the world watched as Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat sealed the Oslo Accords with a hesitant but momentous handshake, with U.S. President Bill Clinton standing between them. It was honestly a moment of incredible hope, a seeming dawn of a new era of peace. The Oslo Accords were based on a declaration of principles which was a framework for a 5-year interim period of Palestinian self-government. The plan called for a gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from Palestinian population centers in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It also established a new governing body, the Palestinian Authority, or PA, which would be responsible for civil and security matters in the areas from which Israel withdrew. This interim period was supposed to lead to a permanent status agreement, to be negotiated no later than 1999, which would resolve the most difficult final status issues: the final borders, the fate of Israeli settlements, the status of Jerusalem, and the question of Palestinian refugees. The initial implementation of the accords brought tangible changes. Yasser Arafat and the PLO leadership returned from exile to a triumphant welcome in Gaza. The Palestinian Authority was established, with its own police force, ministries, and a democratically elected council. Israeli troops withdrew from Gaza and from the major Palestinian cities in the West Bank, which were classified as Area A, under full Palestinian control. For the first time in their history, many Palestinians experienced a degree of self-rule, able to see Palestinian police on their streets instead of Israeli soldiers. The hope for a two-state solution, a sovereign Palestinian state living side by side in peace with Israel, seemed closer than ever before. However, the Oslo process was fraught with problems right from the start. It was deeply opposed by extremists on both sides. Palestinian Islamist groups like Hamas launched a wave of suicide bombings against Israeli civilians, trying to derail the peace process. On the Israeli side, right-wing nationalists and religious settlers saw the accords as a betrayal and a terrible security risk. This opposition reached a tragic climax in November 1995 when Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli extremist. His death dealt a devastating blow to the peace process, removing its most powerful and committed Israeli champion and shaking the fragile trust that had begun to form. The optimism of the early Oslo years, well, it gradually faded, replaced by growing frustration and disillusionment on both sides. Palestinians saw that even as the peace process continued, Israeli settlements in the West Bank were expanding at an unprecedented rate, eating away at the land meant for their future state. The promised economic benefits of peace just did not materialize, and their movement remained heavily restricted by Israeli checkpoints. On the other hand, many Israelis felt that the Palestinian Authority was not doing enough to stop terrorism, and that Yasser Arafat was not truly committed to peace. The final status negotiations, which began at Camp David in the summer of 2000, ultimately failed to bridge the vast gap between the two sides on the core issues. The final spark that ignited the second and far more violent uprising came in September 2000. Ariel Sharon, then the leader of the Israeli opposition and a figure reviled by Palestinians for his controversial past, made a highly provocative visit to the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, accompanied by over 1,000 security officers. The visit was seen by Palestinians as a deliberate assertion of Israeli sovereignty over the holy site. It triggered massive protests and clashes, which quickly escalated into a full-blown armed conflict known as the Second Intifada, or the Al-Aqsa Intifada. This uprising was far deadlier and more militarized than the first. The Second Intifada was marked by a horrific wave of Palestinian suicide bombings in Israeli cities, targeting buses, restaurants, and cafes, killing hundreds of Israeli civilians. These attacks terrorized the Israeli public and shattered their belief in the possibility of peace. Israel responded with overwhelming military force, reoccupying the Palestinian cities it had previously withdrawn from, launching targeted assassinations of militant leaders, and placing entire communities under strict curfew for weeks at a time. The Palestinian Authority's security infrastructure was largely dismantled, and Yasser Arafat was confined by the Israeli army to his compound in Ramallah for the final years of his life. The violence of the Second Intifada, which lasted for roughly 5 years and resulted in the deaths of over 1,000 Israelis and more than 3,000 Palestinians, completely destroyed the Oslo peace process. The trust between the two peoples was shattered. In response to the suicide bombings, Israel began construction of the controversial West Bank separation barrier, a massive wall and fence system that cut deep into Palestinian territory. The hope of the 1990s had dissolved into a bitter reality of violence, separation, and deep mutual distrust. The dream of a two-state solution, while still the official goal of the international community, seemed more distant and unattainable than ever before. To understand the situation on the ground today, we must first look at the complex and fragmented reality of the West Bank. Following the Oslo Accords, the territory was divided into 3 distinct zones: Area A, Area B, and Area C, a temporary arrangement that has now become a permanent fixture of the landscape. Area A, which includes the major Palestinian cities like Ramallah, Nablus, and Bethlehem, is officially under the full civil and security control of the Palestinian Authority. This is where the majority of the Palestinian population lives, experiencing a semblance of self-governance in their daily lives. However, these areas are like islands, disconnected from one another, and surrounded by territory that remains under Israeli control. Area B consists of Palestinian villages and rural areas where the Palestinian Authority has civil control, meaning it runs schools and hospitals, but security control is shared with Israel. This means the Israeli military can and frequently does enter these areas to conduct raids and make arrests. Finally, and most significantly, there is Area C. This zone constitutes over 60% of the West Bank and is under full Israeli civil and security control. It contains all the Israeli settlements as well as vast tracts of land, agricultural areas, and natural resources. For the Palestinians living in Area C, life is extremely difficult, as obtaining permits from the Israeli military administration to build a home or even a water cistern is nearly impossible. This patchwork division has created a geography of control that profoundly impacts every aspect of Palestinian life. A simple journey between 2 Palestinian cities in Area A might require passing through checkpoints in Area C, subject to the discretion of Israeli soldiers. The fragmentation of the land makes any cohesive economic development incredibly challenging and undermines the very notion of a contiguous sovereign territory. The landscape is a confusing and often contradictory mosaic of Palestinian towns, Israeli settlements, military bases, settler-only highways, and checkpoints, all existing side by side in a state of perpetual tension and inequality. This reality on the ground is a far cry from the vision of a viable, independent state that was promised by the peace process. The situation is a constant source of friction and frustration. For Palestinians, the inability to move freely within their own territory, the constant presence of a foreign military, and the relentless expansion of settlements are daily reminders of the occupation and their lack of sovereignty. For Israelis, particularly the settlers living in the West Bank, the landscape is one of biblical heartland and security imperatives where checkpoints and military presence are seen as necessary measures to protect them from potential attacks. This fragmented reality is the physical manifestation of the unresolved political conflict, a landscape where 2 peoples live in the same space but in entirely separate and unequal worlds, with the path to a unified future more obscured than ever. In the heart of the West Bank, just 10 miles north of Jerusalem, lies the city of Ramallah. Since the Oslo Accords, Ramallah has become the de facto administrative and political capital of the Palestinian Authority. It is here that the PA has its government ministries, its presidential compound, and its security headquarters. In many ways, Ramallah presents a picture of what a future Palestinian state could look like. The city boasts a vibrant and cosmopolitan atmosphere, with trendy cafes, modern restaurants, art galleries, and a bustling nightlife. It is the hub of the Palestinian economy, home to banks, telecommunication companies, and a well-educated professional middle class. Walking through the city center, one can feel a palpable energy and a sense of normalcy that is often absent in other parts of the West Bank. Young people gather in coffee shops with their laptops, international diplomats and NGO workers fill the hotels, and new high-rise buildings are constantly under construction, reshaping the city's skyline. This has led some to describe Ramallah as a bubble, an island of relative prosperity and liberal culture that is somewhat insulated from the harsher realities of the occupation that surrounds it. It is a city that showcases Palestinian resilience, creativity, and the aspiration for a modern, functioning state. However, this bubble is fragile and can be burst at any moment. Despite being in Area A, under full Palestinian Authority control, the Israeli military retains the right to enter the city at will. It is not uncommon for Israeli military jeeps to conduct nighttime raids in Ramallah to arrest political activists or suspected militants, a stark reminder that ultimate control still rests with Israel. The city is also encircled by Israeli settlements and checkpoints, and the separation barrier is visible from its western neighborhoods. The economic prosperity of Ramallah is heavily dependent on foreign aid and on the permits and goodwill of the Israeli authorities who control all the borders. Ramallah thus represents both the promise and the paradox of the Palestinian situation today. It is a testament to what Palestinians can build for themselves when given a degree of autonomy, a functioning and lively center of national life. Yet it also highlights the profound limitations of that autonomy. The city's vibrancy exists within a cage, its potential constrained by the larger political reality of occupation. For the residents of Ramallah, life is a constant navigation between the aspirations of statehood, represented by their thriving city, and the ever-present constraints of a conflict that refuses to be resolved, making their normal lives feel precarious and contingent. Just a few miles south of Jerusalem lies Bethlehem, a city whose name is synonymous with peace and Christmas for billions of people around the world. As the biblical birthplace of Jesus, it is a site of immense religious importance and a major destination for Christian pilgrims and tourists. The city's focal point is Manger Square and the ancient Church of the Nativity, which is built over the grotto where Jesus is believed to have been born. The tourism industry is the lifeblood of Bethlehem's economy, supporting thousands of families who work in hotels, restaurants, and shops, selling handcrafted olive wood souvenirs. The city's identity is deeply intertwined with its Christian heritage and its role as a global center of pilgrimage. However, beneath the surface of festive lights and religious devotion, lies a city deeply affected by the political conflict. Bethlehem, like Ramallah, is part of Area A, but it is almost completely surrounded by the Israeli separation barrier. The wall, which in this area is a formidable 26-foot-high concrete structure, cuts the city off from its historic connection to nearby Jerusalem, which is now only accessible through a heavily fortified checkpoint. This separation has had a devastating impact on the city's economy and social fabric, turning what was once a short, seamless journey into a major undertaking and isolating Bethlehem from its most important neighboring city. The Christian population of Bethlehem, one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, has been steadily declining for decades. The economic hardships caused by the occupation, the restrictions on movement, and the general lack of hope for a political resolution have led many Christians to emigrate in search of better opportunities abroad. This demographic shift is a source of great concern for local church leaders who fear that the city's unique Christian character is being eroded. The presence of the wall and the daily struggles of life under occupation stand in stark contrast to the message of peace and goodwill that Bethlehem represents to the world. Visiting Bethlehem today is to experience this duality firsthand. One can visit the sacred sites and feel the deep spirituality of the place, while just a few hundred yards away, the imposing concrete wall, covered in political art and graffiti, serves as a stark testament to the realities of the conflict. The city is a microcosm of the Palestinian struggle, a place of ancient history and deep cultural pride, trying to survive and maintain its identity in the face of immense political and economic pressure. The story of modern Bethlehem is a story of faith and resilience, lived out in the shadow of a wall that separates it from its past and clouds its future. One of the most visible and controversial landmarks of the modern conflict is the West Bank separation barrier. Construction began back in 2002, at the height of the Second Intifada, a period marked by devastating Palestinian suicide bombings inside Israel. The stated purpose of the barrier from the Israeli government's perspective is purely for security. They refer to it as the security fence and argue that it's a non-violent defensive measure necessary to prevent terrorists from crossing into Israel. Officials point to the dramatic drop in suicide bombings since its construction as definitive proof of its effectiveness. For Israelis, the barrier is a symbol of protection, a necessary evil in a dangerous neighborhood. The memory of buses and cafes being blown up is a deep trauma in the Israeli psyche. For many, the fence allows them to live without constant fear. They see it not as a political border but as a temporary security line that could be moved or dismantled as part of a future peace agreement. However, for Palestinians, the structure is known as the apartheid wall. They see it as a brutal instrument of land grab and collective punishment. A key point of contention is its route. Only about 1/5 of the barrier is built along the Green Line. The other 4/5 cut deep into the West Bank, effectively annexing Israeli settlements and Palestinian agricultural land. The wall separates farmers from their fields, students from their schools, and families from their relatives. The International Court of Justice declared the barrier's route illegal and called for it to be dismantled. However, Israel has rejected this ruling. The barrier has become a potent symbol of the occupation. It's a massive, physical manifestation of the separation between the two peoples. Its different names, security fence versus apartheid wall, perfectly encapsulate the irreconcilable narratives of this struggle. For the tens of thousands of Palestinians whose daily lives are directly impacted by the separation barrier, its existence is a constant and grinding hardship. The wall creates a surreal and fragmented geography, trapping some communities in enclaves and cutting others off from their livelihoods. In some areas, Palestinian villages have been left on the Israeli side of the barrier, separated from the rest of the West Bank. Residents of these seam zones must pass through checkpoints to access their own cities and services, and their relatives from the West Bank need special permits to visit them, which are often difficult to obtain. Their lives are lived in a state of perpetual limbo. The economic consequences for Palestinian farmers have been particularly devastating. The wall's route often separates farmers from their agricultural land and olive groves, which have been in their families for generations. To access their own land, they must now apply for permits from the Israeli military, and are only allowed to pass through specific agricultural gates in the barrier, which are often open for limited and unpredictable hours. Many farmers have lost access to their land altogether, unable to cultivate their crops or harvest their olives, leading to a loss of income and the destruction of a traditional way of life that has sustained their communities for centuries. The psychological impact of living in the shadow of the wall is also profound. For many, especially children, the towering concrete slabs and barbed wire fences are a constant, intimidating presence. The wall is a physical reminder of their confinement and powerlessness. It has become a canvas for protest, with local and international artists covering its surface with powerful murals, graffiti, and political messages. The famous British street artist Banksy, for example, has painted several iconic images on the wall in Bethlehem, using satire and art to draw global attention to the absurdity and injustice of the situation. This art is a form of non-violent resistance, an attempt to reclaim a small piece of dignity in the face of an oppressive structure. Ultimately, the separation barrier has transformed the human landscape of the West Bank. It has deepened the separation between Israelis and Palestinians, making interaction and understanding between the two peoples even more difficult. While Israelis living on the other side of the wall may feel safer, Palestinians living in its shadow experience it as a daily form of collective punishment that has entrenched the occupation and made the prospect of a viable, contiguous Palestinian state seem all the more remote. The wall stands as a grim monument to the failure of politics, a physical scar on the land that symbolizes the deep and painful divisions of the present. To complete our look at the landscape today, we must turn our attention to the Gaza Strip, a small, densely populated coastal territory that has a unique and tragic history. Just 25 miles long and a few miles wide, Gaza is home to over 2 million Palestinians, the majority of whom are registered refugees from the 1948 war and their descendants. This makes it one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Following the Oslo Accords, Gaza became a major center for the Palestinian Authority. However, the political landscape of Gaza was dramatically and violently transformed in 2007, a change that continues to define its reality today. In 2006, the Palestinian Islamist group Hamas won a surprising victory in the Palestinian legislative elections. This led to a tense and ultimately violent power struggle with the rival Fatah party which had dominated Palestinian politics for decades. The conflict culminated in a short but bloody civil war in Gaza in June 2007, from which Hamas emerged victorious. They forcibly expelled all Fatah and Palestinian Authority officials from the territory, seizing full control. This event created a deep and lasting schism in Palestinian politics, with Hamas governing Gaza and the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority governing the autonomous parts of the West Bank. The Hamas takeover prompted an immediate and harsh reaction from Israel and the international community. Hamas is officially designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, the European Union, and other countries due to its history of attacks on Israeli civilians and its charter, which calls for the destruction of Israel. In response to the takeover, Israel, with the cooperation of Egypt, imposed a strict land, air, and sea blockade on the Gaza Strip. The stated goal of the blockade was to weaken Hamas, prevent it from importing weapons, and put pressure on the group to renounce violence and recognize Israel. This political division and the subsequent blockade have left Gaza completely isolated from the outside world, and from the other part of the Palestinian territory, the West Bank. For over a decade and a half, the people of Gaza have lived under the rule of an authoritarian Islamist government and under a crippling external siege. This has created a unique and dire situation, a chronic humanitarian crisis that has had a devastating impact on every single person living in the Strip. The story of modern Gaza is a story of isolation, conflict, and a struggle for survival against unimaginable odds. The blockade imposed on the Gaza Strip in 2007 has had a catastrophic effect on its economy and infrastructure. Israel and Egypt control virtually everything that goes in and out of the territory, severely restricting the flow of goods, fuel, and construction materials. For years, the list of prohibited items included things like cilantro, chocolate, and toys, under the justification that these were luxuries and not humanitarian necessities. While some of these restrictions have been eased, the import of dual-use items, materials like cement, steel, and certain chemicals that could potentially be used for military purposes, remains tightly controlled, making it incredibly difficult to rebuild homes and infrastructure destroyed in successive rounds of conflict. The economic impact has been devastating. With exports from Gaza almost completely banned and imports severely limited, local industries and businesses have collapsed. The agricultural sector has been crippled by the inability to export produce, and by Israeli-enforced buffer zones that prevent farmers from accessing land near the border fence. The fishing industry, once a key part of Gaza's economy, has been decimated by a strict naval blockade that limits fishermen to a small, overfished zone close to the coast. As a result, unemployment rates in Gaza are among the highest in the world, regularly exceeding 50%, with youth unemployment being even higher. The majority of the population has become dependent on international humanitarian aid for their basic survival. The blockade has also led to a severe and chronic energy crisis. Gaza has only one power plant, which has been repeatedly damaged in conflicts and operates at a fraction of its capacity due to fuel shortages and disputes over payment between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. The result is that most homes and businesses in Gaza receive electricity for only a few hours a day. This affects everything from refrigeration and sanitation to the ability of hospitals to operate life-saving equipment. Access to clean water is another critical issue, with over 95% of the water from Gaza's aquifer being unfit for human consumption due to contamination and over-extraction. The blockade has effectively trapped 2 million people in what many have described as the world's largest open-air prison. Movement in and out of Gaza is almost impossible for ordinary Palestinians. The Erez crossing into Israel is restricted to a very small number of medical patients, business people, and aid workers who can obtain a permit. The Rafah crossing into Egypt is also frequently closed for long periods. This isolation prevents students from attending universities abroad, prevents people from seeking specialized medical care, and separates families, trapping an entire generation in a cycle of poverty and despair with little hope for a better future. The most profound impact of the blockade and the recurrent cycles of conflict is the immense human cost borne by the civilian population of Gaza. Since the Hamas takeover in 2007, Gaza and Israel have been engaged in multiple wars and numerous smaller escalations of violence. Hamas and other militant groups have fired thousands of rockets and mortars into Israeli towns, terrorizing civilian communities in southern Israel. Israel has responded with massive airstrikes and military ground incursions into Gaza, causing widespread destruction and a staggering loss of life. In these conflicts, it is the civilians, particularly children, who have paid the highest price. The psychological toll on the population is immense. An entire generation of children in Gaza has grown up knowing nothing but blockade and war. Studies have shown that a vast majority of them suffer from symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. They live with the constant fear of the next bombing campaign, the sound of drones overhead, and the knowledge that there is no safe place to escape. The lack of opportunities, the poverty, and the sense of hopelessness create a fertile ground for radicalization, as young people see little alternative to joining militant factions that promise purpose and revenge. The healthcare system in Gaza is on the verge of collapse, overwhelmed by the chronic shortages of electricity, clean water, medicine, and essential equipment caused by the blockade. Hospitals struggle to cope with the casualties from conflicts and are unable to provide adequate care for patients with chronic illnesses like cancer or diabetes. The permit system to allow patients to travel to Israel or the West Bank for life-saving treatment is complex and often unreliable, with many patients being denied permits or having their appointments delayed, sometimes with fatal consequences. The blockade has turned access to basic health care into a privilege rather than a right. The situation in Gaza stands as one of the most acute and unresolved humanitarian crises in the world today. While Israel maintains that the blockade is a necessary security measure to contain a hostile terrorist entity, critics and human rights organizations argue that it constitutes a form of collective punishment against an entire population, which is illegal under international law. The story of Gaza is a tragic tale of political failure, where 2 million people are caught in the crossfire between an Islamist militant group and a powerful military state, their hopes for a dignified life and a peaceful future buried under the rubble of conflict and the weight of a crippling siege. As our journey through this ancient and contested land comes to a close, we find ourselves standing at the confluence of two powerful and deeply held histories. We have traveled from the sacred precincts of Jerusalem, where the prayers of three faiths echo off the same stones, to the modern, vibrant streets of Tel Aviv, a city built on a dream of a new beginning. We have stood atop the windswept fortress of Masada, a symbol of defiant last stands, and walked in the shadow of the separation barrier in Bethlehem, a stark monument to modern divisions. Each landmark, each city, and each stone has told a piece of a larger, more complex story than the headlines could ever convey. They are the physical anchors of memory, identity, and aspiration for two peoples who are inextricably bound together by the geography they share. What becomes profoundly clear is that this land does not belong to a single narrative. It is a place of shared stones but divided hearts, where the same patch of earth can represent a homeland restored for one people and a homeland lost for another. The Western Wall is a symbol of Jewish endurance and homecoming, yet it stands just below the Haram al-Sharif, a sanctuary of immense Islamic importance. Independence Hall in Tel Aviv marks the triumphant birth of a nation, an event that simultaneously triggered the catastrophe, the Nakba, for the Palestinian people. This duality is not a contradiction to be resolved, but the fundamental truth of the conflict, a painful reality that must be confronted to grasp its enduring nature. The story of Israel and Palestine is therefore not a linear tale, but a tangled web of competing destinies. It is the story of a people, the Jews, who after 2 millennia of persecution and the unspeakable horror of the Holocaust, sought and achieved a return to their ancestral home, building a powerful and dynamic state against all odds. It is also the story of a people, the Palestinians, who saw this return as an invasion, leading to their own dispossession, exile, and a decades-long struggle under occupation for the right to a state of their own. These are not two separate stories happening in the same place. They are one story experienced from two irreconcilable perspectives, a single historical event with two names. To ignore one of these narratives in favor of the other is to willfully misunderstand the very essence of the conflict. It is to reduce a complex human tragedy to a simplistic melodrama of heroes and villains, a framing that serves only to perpetuate division and hatred. Our journey has been an attempt to move beyond this binary, to hold both truths in our hands at the same time, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. Only by acknowledging the legitimacy of both people's connection to the land and the genuine pain contained within both of their historical experiences can we begin to see the full, intricate, and deeply human picture. Throughout this exploration, we've seen how the past is not just a prelude to the present, it's a living, breathing force that shapes every aspect of the current reality. The weight of history in this land is honestly immense and inescapable. For Israelis, the collective memory is one of vulnerability, of pogroms, expulsions, and of course, the Holocaust. This history has really forged a national psyche that prioritizes security above all else, a deep-seated belief that a strong military and defensible borders are the only guarantees against annihilation. This perspective explains the profound Israeli attachment to security measures, from the separation barrier to the control of the West Bank, which are often seen as essential defenses in a hostile region, no matter the cost to others. For Palestinians, the weight of their history is one of dispossession, occupation, and statelessness. The memory of the Nakba, the experience of life in refugee camps, and the daily indignities of military occupation have forged an identity rooted in resistance and the demand for justice. This history, fuels their unwavering insistence on the right of return, the end of the occupation, and the establishment of a sovereign state with East Jerusalem as its capital. From their perspective, the struggle is not a choice but a necessity, the only way to reclaim the dignity and national rights that have been denied to them for generations. Their history is a story of enduring a continuous loss of land and control. These two historical experiences create a chasm of perception that is almost impossible to bridge. An Israeli soldier at a checkpoint sees himself as a protector, defending his family from the terrorism that has haunted his nation's past. A Palestinian trying to pass through that same checkpoint sees an oppressor, a symbol of a foreign occupation that controls his movement and denies his freedom. Both are acting based on the lessons learned from their own people's history. This is really the tragic heart of the conflict. Two peoples, both traumatized by their past, are now locked in a struggle where the actions one takes to feel secure are the very actions that make the other feel oppressed. Understanding this dynamic is crucial. It moves the conversation away from simplistic judgments and toward a more empathetic recognition of the genuine fears and aspirations that motivate both sides. The conflict is not driven by an irrational hatred, though hatred is certainly one of its toxic byproducts. It's driven by the collision of two powerful and legitimate historical narratives, each with its own set of traumas and dreams. Until both sides can find a way to acknowledge the weight of the other's history, they will remain trapped in a cycle where each is simply reacting to the ghosts of their own past. It is tempting, when faced with a conflict as emotionally charged as the one between Israelis and Palestinians, to seek moral clarity by identifying a clear protagonist and antagonist. Modern media and political discourse often encourage this, pushing us to choose a side and to view the struggle through a simple lens of good versus evil. However, as our journey has shown, such a simplistic framework completely fails to capture the profound complexity of the situation. This is not a story with a straightforward hero and a clear-cut villain. It's a tragedy, in the classic sense of the word. A clash of right against right, a struggle between two peoples who both have deep, legitimate, and compelling claims to the same small piece of land. The Zionist movement was born from a genuine and desperate need for a safe haven for a people who had been persecuted for centuries. The creation of Israel was a remarkable achievement of national liberation, a story of hope and resilience in the face of unimaginable tragedy. The desire of the Jewish people to live in security and sovereignty in their ancestral homeland is honestly a legitimate and understandable aspiration. To deny the validity of this national dream is to ignore the painful history that gave it birth and the incredible success it has achieved in creating a vibrant democratic society from the ashes of despair. At the same time, the Palestinian people have a powerful and just claim to self-determination in the land where their ancestors have lived for centuries. Their struggle against dispossession and occupation is a legitimate national liberation movement in its own right. The Palestinian experience of the Nakba, of life as refugees, and of decades under military rule is a story of profound and enduring injustice. To dismiss their aspirations for a state of their own, for freedom from foreign control, and for a resolution to their refugee status, is to deny them the same basic rights to dignity and sovereignty that every other nation takes for granted. Therefore, a true understanding requires us to move beyond the comfortable but misleading narrative of good versus evil. It demands that we hold the legitimacy of both national movements in our minds simultaneously. It requires us to acknowledge that Israel's creation, a story of triumph for one people, was inextricably linked to a catastrophe for another. It forces us to recognize that the ongoing occupation, which Israel justifies on the grounds of security, inflicts real and daily suffering on millions of Palestinians. Only by embracing this complex, uncomfortable, and morally ambiguous reality can we begin to have an honest conversation about the conflict and the path forward. The landmarks we have visited on this journey serve as more than just historical backdrops. They are really a mirror reflecting the core issues of the conflict. They are the physical spaces where the competing narratives and aspirations of both peoples collide most directly. The intense disputes over the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, are not just about religious practice. They're a struggle for sovereignty over the symbolic heart of the land. Control of this single sacred site is seen by both sides as the ultimate validation of their historical claim, making any compromise on its status almost unthinkable. The holiness of the site, honestly, amplifies the political conflict to a divine existential level. Similarly, the modern landmarks tell a story of division and inequality. The sprawling, red-roofed settlements in the West Bank are seen by their Israeli residents as a fulfillment of a historical and religious destiny, a return to the biblical heartland. Yet to their Palestinian neighbors, these same buildings are symbols of an illegal occupation and a land grab that is systematically destroying the possibility of their own state. The separation barrier, a security fence to Israelis and an apartheid wall to Palestinians, is another such mirror. It physically manifests the chasm in perception, where one side's solution to fear is the very architecture of the other side's confinement. Even the ancient ruins carry the weight of the modern struggle. The story of Masada has been transformed into a foundational myth for modern Israel, a powerful symbol of national defiance and the will to survive. It is a story of Jewish heroism that reinforces a modern ethos of self-reliance. Conversely, the Roman ruins at Caesarea remind us that this land has been ruled by many empires and that its history is far more layered than any single national narrative can encompass. These sites become tools in a battle for legitimacy, with each side emphasizing the parts of history that strengthen its own claim while often overlooking the rest. By looking at these landmarks, we see the conflict etched into the very landscape. The stones do not lie. They simply bear witness to the layers of history that have been built upon them. They show us how sacred spaces can become battlegrounds and how modern construction can become an act of political warfare. The struggle for Israel and Palestine is not just a fight over territory, but a fight over the meaning of that territory, a battle to control its story. The landmarks are the primary evidence in this trial of history, and they reflect the deep and painful divisions that have yet to be resolved. Our journey through the past has led us to a deeply troubled and uncertain present, a landscape defined by a series of critical, unresolved questions. The most fundamental of these is the question of statehood. Will there ever be a sovereign, viable, and independent Palestinian state alongside Israel? For decades, the two-state solution has been the cornerstone of international diplomacy, the stated goal of peace negotiations. Yet today, its prospects seem dimmer than ever. The relentless expansion of Israeli settlements has carved up the West Bank to such an extent that many observers on both sides now believe a contiguous Palestinian state is no longer possible. This leads to another profound and unsettling question. If not two states, then what? A growing number of voices are beginning to speak of a one-state reality, acknowledging that Israel already controls the entire territory, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. But what kind of state would this be? Would it be a democratic state with equal rights for all its inhabitants, which would mean the end of Israel as a Jewish majority state? Or would it be a state that formalizes the current system of inequality, where millions of Palestinians are ruled by Israel but are denied citizenship and basic political rights, a reality that many already label as a form of apartheid? This question strikes at the very core of Israel's identity as both a Jewish and a democratic state. The unresolved question of Jerusalem looms over everything. Both Israelis and Palestinians claim the city as their capital, and its fate is perhaps the most emotionally charged issue of all. Can the city be shared? Can a political formula be found that satisfies the national aspirations of both sides, while protecting the religious freedoms of Jews, Christians, and Muslims? The current reality is one of Israeli sovereignty over a unified city, a status that is not recognized by most of the world and is fiercely rejected by Palestinians. The future of Jerusalem is not just a political question, it is a question of identity, faith, and history for billions of people. Finally, there is the enduring and painful question of the Palestinian refugees. What does justice look like for the millions of people whose families lost their homes in 1948? The Palestinian demand for a right of return remains a central pillar of their national identity, while for Israel, its implementation is seen as a demographic death sentence for the Jewish state. Is there a creative and compassionate solution that can acknowledge the historical injustice done to the refugees without threatening Israel's existence? These are not easy questions, and they have no simple answers. They are the great unresolved dilemmas that keep this conflict locked in a painful and dangerous stalemate. One of the clearest lessons from this deep dive into the history of Israel and Palestine is that there are no simple solutions. The conflict is a complex, multi-layered problem that has been accumulating grievances and traumas for more than a century. Anyone who claims to have a quick or easy fix is either naive or disingenuous. The illusion that one more war, one more security barrier, one more diplomatic initiative, or one more popular uprising will finally resolve the issue has been shattered time and time again. The reality is that the core issues are so deeply entrenched and so existentially important to both sides that they defy any straightforward resolution. The belief that the conflict can be solved purely through military force is a dangerous illusion. Israel, with its overwhelming military superiority, has demonstrated that it can contain resistance, manage the occupation, and win conventional wars. However, it has also learned that military power cannot extinguish the Palestinian desire for self-determination. Decades of occupation and multiple wars in Gaza have not brought lasting security or peace. They have only bred more resentment and fueled new cycles of violence. True security can never be achieved by force alone when the underlying political grievances remain unaddressed. Lasting peace cannot be imposed at the barrel of a gun. Similarly, the belief that the conflict can be resolved by simply ignoring the other side's core concerns is an equal illusion. For decades, some on the Israeli side have hoped that the Palestinian national movement would simply fade away, that the pressures of occupation and the passage of time would lead them to give up their aspirations. This has not happened. Conversely, for decades, some on the Palestinian side have hoped that armed struggle and international pressure would eventually lead to the collapse of the Israeli state. This has also not happened. Both peoples are deeply rooted in the land and are not going anywhere. The illusion that one side can achieve total victory and erase the other is a fantasy that has only led to more bloodshed. Therefore, any realistic path forward must begin by shedding these illusions. It must be based on the sober recognition that both Israelis and Palestinians have legitimate rights, deep historical connections, and profound security fears that must be addressed. It requires an understanding that a solution cannot be a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other loses. The only viable long-term solution is one in which both sides can see a future for themselves that includes security, dignity, and a national home. The path to such a solution is not simple or short. It is a long and arduous process that requires painful compromises and a willingness to see the humanity in one's enemy. If a path toward a more peaceful future is to be found, it must begin with the difficult and courageous act of acknowledgement. This goes beyond political negotiations and signed agreements. It is a fundamental shift in consciousness that must happen at the societal level. It requires each side to acknowledge the truth and the pain of the other's narrative, even while holding on to their own. For Israelis, this means acknowledging the reality of the Nakba and the profound injustice of the dispossession that occurred in 1948. It means acknowledging the daily reality of suffering and indignity that the ongoing military occupation inflicts upon millions of Palestinians. It means seeing Palestinians not just as a security threat, but as a people with a legitimate right to freedom. For Palestinians, acknowledgement means recognizing the deep and historical connection of the Jewish people to the land and the legitimacy of their need for a secure homeland. It means acknowledging the genuine fear of annihilation that is rooted in the Jewish experience of the Holocaust and centuries of persecution. It means unequivocally condemning and renouncing acts of terrorism that target innocent civilians, and recognizing that such acts are not only morally wrong, but also strategically disastrous for their own cause. It means acknowledging that Israel is a permanent reality in the region, and that their own statehood will have to be realized alongside it, not in place of it. This mutual acknowledgement is the essential foundation upon which any lasting peace can be built. It is the process of humanizing the other, of moving beyond the caricatures and demonization that have fueled the conflict for so long. It is about creating a space where two competing truths can coexist. This does not mean abandoning one's own identity or national aspirations. It simply means recognizing that the other is also a human being with a story, with rights, and with fears that are just as real as one's own. It is the first step toward breaking the cycle of victimhood, where both sides see themselves as the primary victim and are therefore unable to see the pain they are inflicting. This process is incredibly difficult, and will face immense resistance from extremists on both sides who thrive on hatred and division. It requires brave leadership and a grassroots commitment to education and dialogue. It means teaching the next generation a more complex and inclusive version of their own history, one that includes the story of the other. It is a long-term project of empathy and reconciliation, but it is the only path that leads away from the abyss of perpetual conflict. A future of peace cannot be built on a foundation of denial. It must be rooted in the difficult soil of mutual acknowledgement. In a conflict so defined by violence, despair, and political failure, it can be easy to lose all hope. The daily news from the region often presents a relentless cycle of tragedy, and the prospects for a just and lasting peace can seem impossibly remote. The political leadership on both sides often seems more interested in managing the conflict than in resolving it. And the chasm of distrust between the two peoples has never been wider. Yet, even in this bleak landscape, the enduring power of hope persists in small but significant ways, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Hope can be found in the joint Israeli-Palestinian organizations that refuse to give up on the dream of a shared future. Groups like the Parents Circle Families Forum, which brings together bereaved families from both sides who have lost loved ones to the conflict, work tirelessly to promote reconciliation and understanding. They use their shared pain as a bridge to humanize the other, proving that even those who have suffered the most can choose empathy over revenge. Hope is found in the Israeli human rights groups that document the abuses of the occupation, and in the Palestinian activists who advocate for nonviolent resistance. Hope is found in the small, everyday interactions that defy the narrative of hate. It is in the Israeli doctors and Palestinian nurses working side by side in Jerusalem hospitals to save lives without asking about nationality. It is in the tech entrepreneurs from Tel Aviv and Ramallah who collaborate on joint ventures, building economic bridges that can one day support a political peace. It is in the musicians, artists, and filmmakers from both communities who use their craft to explore their shared humanity and challenge the stereotypes that divide them. These are often small, isolated lights in a vast darkness, but they show that another way is possible. By arming ourselves with a deeper understanding of the complex history and the competing narratives, we can move beyond the simplistic headlines and contribute to a more informed and constructive conversation. This knowledge is a prerequisite for any meaningful hope. It allows us to appreciate the depth of the challenges while also recognizing the legitimacy of both people's aspirations. The beautiful landscapes of this ancient land have witnessed too much bloodshed and too much sorrow. The ultimate hope is that one day, they can become a place of genuine peace and justice for all who call it home, a land where the stories of both Israelis and Palestinians can be honored, and a shared future can finally